Good evening, everyone. Nyama, Wernjeri Kulin, Mirambikal Bik Wenerop Darebin, Bagangbul Awichuri, Bagangukal Nangit Bambuth Ba Yellingbu. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, traditional custodians of the land on which Darebin Council stands, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'll now move to membership. Membership of Council is as listed in the agenda, noting that we have an apology from Councillor Tim Lawrence. Item 3 on the agenda, disclosures of conflicts of interest. Councillors, you have a conflict to disclose.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, I have a conflict for item 8.2 as I'm currently employed in the aged care sector.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Welcome, councillors, staff, and particularly welcome to members of our community here and in the gallery and watching online. It's really great to see so many members of the community here tonight, and thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I would like to set up my expectations in regard to our behaviour and remind councillors of their obligations under the Code of Conduct. At Darebin, we pride ourselves on being a progressive and contemporary council. In the interests of demonstrating exemplary leadership, I have high expectations that we'll all be professional in our conduct throughout the evening and respectful in our debate. It's important for both councillors and the community to remember that our council chamber is both a workplace and a public space, and we have an obligation to ensure the working environment and public forums are safe for everyone, both emotionally as well as physically. I want to be clear that I won't tolerate any form of personal acrimony or insult, grandstanding or yelling, nor will I put up with talking over the top of one another, any use of unreasonable or impolite language or interjections from the gallery. Councillors, we have a lot to get through tonight, and as always, I expect you to direct all questions and comments that you have through me as the chair. I will endeavour to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to talk, but I will also make sure that we stick to time. I know many members of the community are here tonight in relation to the parking matter, which is scheduled later in the agenda. Councillors, I will first attend to question time, but given the strong community interest in item 10.1, notice of motion, I wondered whether any councillor would like to move a motion that the order of the agenda be changed so that the item is considered after urgent business and before consideration of reports.
Mayor, I'll move that way, that we bring forward the notice of motion as the first item of business.
I'll second that.
So moved. Seconded, Councillor Greco. Thank you. All those in favour? That motion is carried. What that means for members of the gallery is that we won't wait until number 10 on the agenda to get to the parking matter. We will proceed through the agenda with question and submission time, petitions, urgent business, and then immediately move to item 10.1. That brings us now to confirmation of the minutes of the council meetings. Moved by Councillor Lasserf, seconded by Councillor Messina. All those in favour? That is carried. That brings us to question and submission time. To members of the gallery, we have had approximately 50 questions submitted prior to the meeting. And we have 30 minutes allotted for question time. As per our usual practice, I'll start with the questions that were submitted online. If you submitted a question online, when I call your name, if you could please come up to the lectern, state your name and suburb, and then ask your question. It's important that you direct your questions to myself as the Mayor and that you limit your questions to 2, as this gives other people an opportunity to ask questions. Please make your questions brief and to the point. There is no need for lengthy introductory comments to preface your questions. If, as we pass through the questions, you feel that your question has already been responded to, please let me know when we call your name, and we'll try not to double up on too many of the responses. Once all of the online questions have been read out and answered, we'll then call for other questions and work through them as normal. It is the practice of council at times, if questions go over 30 minutes, for councillors to move a motion to continue. So please don't get stressed if you think we're not going to make it within the half an hour. We really do want to hear from people, and we'll probably go through that process of moving a motion to extend question time. So I'd like to invite first person up, which is David Schultz. Is David here? No. What I'll propose with those people who aren't here, I will come back to them, but in the interests of making it through, I will put those questions to one side to be written in the minutes and answered in the minutes so that we can hear from all of those people who are here tonight. George Abionis of Town Hall Avenue. No. Okay. Yeah. We do know that some people have indicated that they will attend. If they are not here at the moment, we may come back to them. If people have indicated they're not attending, we'll just make their answers in writing. Diane Chibowski, please come up to the lectern. Welcome.
This is a first for me. Diane Chibowski, I live at Reservoir. My question was, what's happening with the old Reservoir Library, and also with the extension and all that stuff that's happening around the station, that's sort of linked with it, would council consider multi-level car parking? Because I didn't realise this was a thing about parking at all. So yeah, will they consider doing multi-level car parking somewhere?
Thank you very much for your question, Diane. A detailed analysis and strategic review of key council properties, including the Reservoir Library building, is currently underway, and this will identify options for the future use of these significant assets in support of our council plan objectives. All options will be considered as part of that review. Simon Mackey. No, I'll come back and check if Simon's here at the end. Fran Martin. Freya McCarthy. Nope. Jennifer Tran. Alistair Baston. Welcome, Alistair.
Good evening. Thank you for having us. Alistair Baston, Northcote 3070. Please provide a full financial breakdown of the cost to date and expected future costs incurred or to be incurred on the Darebin parking strategy 2019 to 2029. That should include, but not be limited to, external reports and advice, travel and study tours, printing materials, and the cost of internal resources, including management time. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. External costs to date have been around $300,000 across 2 financial years as a result of specialist advice, collection of data, consultation and document design. Staff time has been estimated at $160,000. I can confirm that no study or travel tours have been undertaken. Thank you. Damien Dempsey. Welcome, Mr. Dempsey.
Hi, I'm Damien Dempsey. I live in Northcote 3070. Mayor, just wondering if you could tell us how many vendors responded to the tender or quote process that was undertaken that led to the engagement of the Consultant Institute for Sensible Transport?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Dempsey. I'll need to take this question on notice as it relates to a statutory procurement process under the Local Government Act regarding public tender processes. We're currently seeking advice about what can be publicly released. We do think we'll be able to make that information available. We just have to check that up.
I have a second question.
Certainly.
Why was the parking strategy and implementation of actions not included in initiatives or major initiatives in the FY18-19 and proposed FY19-20 budgets?
It's not possible for Council to list every single matter individually in the budget papers, but the work is referenced in the 2018-19 Action Plan, which is the supporting document. The 19-20 Action Plan is yet to be finalised.
Thanks.
Thank you. Pat Thurgood. Welcome, Ms Thurgood.
Pat Thurgood, Northcote 3070. I have two questions. My first one, will Council clearly explain in quantifiable terms the short and long-term impact on emissions and or the environment as a result of severely reducing local, visitor and business traffic with the implementation of the draft Darebin parking strategy?
Thank you. Council has not estimated the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on proposed draft parking restrictions, but we do know that transport is a main source of greenhouse gas emissions in Darebin.
Right.
You can move to your second question.
Yes, I will. Why does Council continue to allow high density developments to proceed without mandatory requirement of off-street parking, thus impacting on the environment and existing residential parking?
Thank you. I'll just ask people, sorry, I will ask that you don't, I know that many people have similar questions. Ms Thurgood, you can return and be seated if you'd prefer, or stay there while I answer your question.
No, you don't.
No, whatever. You please return if you'd like, that's fine. For a development to be able to proceed with only a building permit, they must not trigger the need for a planning permit. This would only apply in cases where a building is planned to incorporate car parking in line with the current Victorian planning requirements, which do require appropriate car parking to be included. It is open for developers to seek to provide less parking than is outlined in the planning scheme, but to do so, developers have to apply for a planning permit and to provide evidence that there is still an appropriate number of car parks and that what they're seeking doesn't adversely affect the neighbourhood. There's more? Right. When it makes planning decisions, Council is required to make decisions in accordance with the planning scheme, and Council decisions are subject to appeal at VCAT. Thank you for those questions. Julia Scott. We'll come back to Ms Scott. Mrs D Hackham, not here. I think Mark Carlsberg, I believe, is not attending. Zihad Nicholas. Is Mr Nicholas here? No, we'll come back there. Can I confirm that Kane Leader isn't attending? No. Kate Brocker. Is Ms Brocker here? No, we'll come back there. Mr Peter Beamsley? No. Paul of Salisbury Grove in Northcote. I don't have a surname, I'm sorry, Paul. Welcome.
It's Paul Blameyer from Northcote 3070. The Mayor has justified a proposed ban on visitor parking permits for properties built or renovated since 2004 within this designated zone of Darebin by saying that such properties should be able to accommodate all visitors off-street. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily just about multi-unit developments here, but a house like myself, which is a single number in a street, a regular house. Are you confident that each and every approval granted by Council since 2004 is consistent with this provision for off-street parking? And if this isn't the case, do you agree that a more resident-oriented approach would be appropriate?
Thank you for your question, Paul. While it's obviously impractical to reassess every permit since 2004, I can confirm that Council is required to apply the Victorian Government requirements for car parking in developments. We have been specifically seeking feedback on the proposed arrangement for visitor permits, and I'll take the rest of your question as a comment, but do note particularly your concerns about post-2004 dwellings. They've been noted. Thank you. Mr Gary Wills. Welcome.
Oops. Yeah, Gary Wills, Northcote 3070. My questions are, who was responsible for initiating the Darebin draft parking strategy?
Thank you. Council's Darebin Transport Strategy identifies the need to develop a parking strategy as action number 29. This work follows that requirement of the Council Transport Strategy.
So was anyone responsible for it? Or
Pardon?
who's responsible for it?
The transport team has been undertaking the work.
Okay, thanks. How much was Kapaya Consulting paid for their role in the process?
This information is commercial in confidence under Section 34 of the Freedom of Information Act. Overall external costs to date have been around $300,000 over 2 financial years, including specialist advice, collection of data, consultation and document design.
So no breakdown for individual...
So, no, I'm not permitted under Section 34 of the Freedom of Information Act to give you the breakdown of CAPIA particularly.
Okay, thanks.
Anne Laver. Welcome, Anne.
Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. Anne Laver from Darebin Ratepayers Group for Reed Street, Northcote. Question 1, parking strategy. In seeking to blame officers for the parking strategy debacle, have councillors who have taken this position not also considered that by implication they vacated their role as advocates for and protectors of the community?
I'll take that question partially as a comment. Sorry, I do need to ask people to allow me to answer. I can say that in my experience, every one of the councillors in this room takes their role seriously and does aim to serve their community, spends many hours every week doing that. You have another question, Anne?
Yes, question 2. How will the Darebin Council honour the goal of being open and transparent with the community?
Darebin Council takes its commitment to openness and transparency very seriously and is demonstrating this through doing such widespread consultation on parking and many other topics. There are now fewer matters heard in camera than ever in the past, and I think that's also a demonstration of that transparency, that most matters have been moved out of in-camera discussions and are now held in public.
Yes, that's true, but the reports are not being released. Thank you.
Report.
Move on to Jessica Owen.
Okay. Jessica Owen, Northcote 3070. Regarding the proposed parking strategy, the limitations on visitors' permits and prohibitive costs will impact access of informal carers, like grandparents looking after grandchildren and adult children assisting elderly parents. Has the council budgeted and planned for additional requirements for walking distance childcare and aged care at home support? And if so, can you detail the additional financial allocation you anticipate?
Thank you for that question. Through the community consultation process, we have been actively seeking feedback on the proposed visitor permit arrangements, such as proposals for a carer's permit. Modelling hasn't been done in regards to the specific matters you're asking about, but we have had a lot of similar feedback to that and has been taken into account. Thank you. Peter O'Connell. Welcome, Mr O'Connell.
Peter O'Connell, Northcote 3070. I have 2 questions. So my first question is, how many petitions were received and publicly presented at council meetings in the period 1st of January 2018 to 25th of May 2019, specifically asking for permanent parking restrictions to be imposed in the Darebin City Council jurisdiction, and thus publicly noted in council meeting minutes?
Thank you for that question. Sorry, I just have to turn back because the answer was written on a previous sheet. I think I've got it. Have you got it in front of you? Just note the dates. There are three ways that parking requests can be presented to Council. This can be through public petition at a Council meeting, through a pro forma petition on the website directly to staff, or in a letter requesting changes to staff. 23 parking requests of all forms were received between May 2018 and May 2019. One requested the removal of restrictions. All others requested installation of new restrictions or modification of existing restrictions. While the parking strategy is being reviewed, consideration of all these requests have been put on hold, and others have been decided through officer delegation. So not many have been put through the chamber for decision in that time. That hasn't been the standard practice.
Thank you. My second question is to ask the Council, what was the full list of recommendations made, and what were any alternate recommendations made by the appointed consultant engaged to prepare the Darebin parking strategy in their final report to Council?
Thanks for that question also. Council has received a range of advice in developing the parking strategy. You can find much of it on the website, including the Darebin Strategic Review, which was written in 2018 to provide background advice and data for Council. It contains a number of broad-ranging recommendations. Thank you. Frank Ierino. 27. Serena O'Malley. Serena's here. Welcome.
Serena O'Mealy, and my postcode is Reservoir 3073. I have a similar question about the parking petitions, which I think you've partially answered, but I'll ask the full question anyway. Councils have told members of the public that Darebin Council has received 25 petitions from residents requesting changes to parking restrictions. Why haven't all of these petitions been formally presented to Council meetings and recorded in the minutes? And has Council made any changes to street parking restrictions based upon petitions that have not been formally presented to Council meetings?
Thank you for those questions. It hasn't been the process of this Council for as long as I can remember for petitions to have to come to a Council meeting. Part of the reason for that is that it holds up business and means that people have to wait longer to have parking issues in their streets resolved. So the process was streamlined many years ago so that there was a way in which residents could contribute to decisions about parking in their street and get action, and that wasn't held up. There was a second part of your question in relation to, so were parking restrictions put in without it coming to Council? Yes, they certainly have been.
Okay. I wouldn't mind following that up in a second, but given that signing a petition is a public act, in future, will Council undertake to table all petitions on any subject in Council meetings, and also ensure that the number of signatories to a petition are always formally recorded in the minutes? I'll have to take that question on notice. It's not necessary in terms of the process and might be more cumbersome and actually result in hold-ups for residents, but we will review that and take it on notice and get back to you. Sorry, just to clarify this, if, for instance, all of the residents around Ruthven Station all have a problem with car parking in their street, they could all individually put petitions to Council, and the result would be that other people who also need to access that area would be disadvantaged and wouldn't even know how it came about unless it is tabled in Council and recorded in the minutes.
Thank you. I do understand the purpose of you wanting it to come to Council and that process. As I said, it hasn't been the process because we've responded to residents in their streets individually, and in fact there's been significant requests from the community for this process for us to continue to respond in that way, but that will be something we consider.
Thank you.
Thanks, Serena. Ignacio of Rosemoyne Street.
Hello, my name's Ignacio Rano, Thornbury 3071. My question relates to the Darebin Parking Strategy 2018 review document. There was several bits of information in that seemed relevant to the strategy that didn't appear in the current parking strategy. So across all of Darebin, it appears that there's only 4,500 cars that move to the train stations to ride to either the city or wherever they're going. Now that amounts to about 3 trains, fully stacked, that there's capacity is 1,380 passengers per train, which is pretty full. So my question is, based on the table in the document, it appears that there's several hotspots and concentrated areas where the cars are going, and there's a large number of areas that have very little parking involved with the trains. So why does the strategy adopt such a uniform approach across all the stations, across all of Darebin, if most of them aren't impacted?
Thank you. There are various approaches to managing parking to balance the needs of residents, businesses and visitors. The draft proposal includes a consistent approach to restrictions. It is true that this approach has less flexibility to make fine-grained local adjustments, but there are some benefits to having a consistent approach. In regards to park and ride commuting, officers will respond in writing with some specific studies and research documents on the topic, but I note that much of the feedback that we've received has been similar to the feedback you've offered us then, so thank you.
I've got a second question, which was part of that. Hang on. Which is, what will happen to, where'd it go? Oh, and what do you expect the park and ride passengers to do if you do nothing to support them?
I'm sorry, that was the second. I think I read the answer to that second question. So I'll just say it again. With regards to park and ride commuting, officers will respond in writing with some of the specific studies and research documents on this, topic, so that you can understand what happens in other scenarios. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Mayor Reding, can I ask for an extension of time for 30 minutes, because I think we've reached our first half hour.
Me to second that.
So I move a motion that we extend the question time by 30 minutes.
So moved. Thank you, Councillor Greco, and seconded by Councillor Williams. All those in favour? Thank you. So we've just extended question time by another 30 minutes. Frank Arino. Frank's not here. Libby Zerner. Welcome.
Libby Zerner, 3070. My first question has been partially asked previously around asking for year-to-date expenditure. But as a follow-on from that, I'd really like to get a transparent process moving forward with the named line items that we'd be able to track going forward.
Okay, thank you. So, with respect to line items, I'll refer that to the CEO for consideration of how the budget is presented. And as you said, we have previously given information about the costs.
But the costs are embedded into other line items. There is not a trackable, transparent process for us to, and that's why we're asking, because it's not clear what the year-to-date figures are. And so if it's unclear at this stage, it's unclear moving into the future.
Okay, in relation to the money already expended and the future expenditure?
And we would like a clear, transparent process moving into the future of how we track the expenditure of this strategy.
Okay, thank you. Any future expenditure would obviously depend on the motion that's going to be debated tonight. So there may be no future expenditure, but I will refer that to the CEO, who's responsible for overseeing the development of budgets and the way in which they are presented. Thanks, Libby.
My second question is, as part of a safe and sustainable transport strategy, the community would rightly expect that there's improved infrastructure, especially around walking and cycle paths. Yet in the budget to 2023, Council fails to provide that critical infrastructure in the budget, with actually a decrease in the areas, the categories called footpath and cycleways, open spaces and streetscapes, or in fact other infrastructure which had a zero budget against it to 2023. As the proposed parking strategy 2019 to to 2029 covers the coming 10 years and promotes the increase uptick of walking and pedal power, could the council clearly announce the annual dollar figure that they're prepared to commit to the rollout of all of the infrastructure and the relevant maintenance?
Okay. Thank you. Council has historically and continues to invest heavily in infrastructure to support walking and cycling. $1.9 million has been committed to sustainable transport in the 2018-19 year, and the 2019-20 year draft budget similarly commits $1.9 million. There are other significant amounts of investment that are actually captured in the operational budget in terms of maintenance of footpaths and other infrastructure that enables walking and cycling. So in relation to forward years, I'll have to refer that to the CEO.
There is a decrease.
Okay.
One category was a 35% decrease, another category was a 15% decrease.
So we'll get back to you with an explanation of why that is. We have actually in the last few years significantly increased the budget that's actually been spended in that area over historically what was the case. Thank you. Okay, now Scott Wallace.
Name and postcode, thanks.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Scott Wallace, Northcote 3070. I actually apologise because I submitted 10 questions on behalf of the Facebook members, so the question I ask may not match the ones you've got on my name.
Okay.
Firstly, I wanted to ask
Can I just say, you've got 2 questions, so...
Yeah, I'll just give you 2 that I remember. My question is a clarification on the 2004 question. So on a double frontal residence on a block over 300 metres squared, council planning is not required for construction. Post-2004 properties in this category get no visitor parking and no resident parking. And I was wondering why that would be the case, particularly since it contradicts the VPP policy, which specifically excludes from scope residents that don't increase the occupancy on the lot. I'm not sure if that question makes sense.
Thank you, Scott, for that question. And obviously that relates to the current parking permit policy.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
As much as to the proposed one. And I have heard that concern and want to reassure you that we have heard that concern very loudly. Both the current and proposed parking permits policies don't allow dwellings built and occupied after 2004 to obtain residential parking permits. And this is because at the time that was implemented, council wanted to minimise the impact of new developments on existing residents, shops and services. But rest assured, we have heard that concern come out very clearly in the consultation process.
Okay, cheers, thanks. And the other one, I'll read out, this is not my words necessarily. How will this or future parking strategies ensure the safety of women, the elderly, the disabled and even men in the use of train and other facilities in the affected zones?
Thank you for that question. We'll just make sure that I can find the answer. Safety is a high priority for council. In regards to the parking strategy, I will take your question as a comment. I would also like to note that safety is a much wider issue than just parking, and council is looking at safety across a whole range of different projects around the municipality.
No worries, thanks. I think it was in the context of people who are worried about walking
from the station,
at night.
Certainly.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Julia Nordlinger. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name.
She's not here. I submitted 10 questions and then I only could have 2 per person, so Julia put her name on 2. But wouldn't be able to.
Thank you. Fiona Dixon.
Thanks. Fiona Dixon, Northcote 3070. I just wanted to ask a question that had been previously asked but I don't believe was answered. Who initiated the parking strategy? Was it councillors or was it staff?
Several years ago, in consultation and through discussion at briefings and other forums, it was determined that council should have a parking strategy. It was recommended to councillors that a parking strategy be developed because it's a contemporary thing to do in other municipalities, and so the agreement was that it be something that was delivered, and dollars were allocated in the budget for the delivery of a parking strategy.
It's very interesting because many people here tonight were told by councillors previously that they knew nothing about this, that this was all the Transport Division.
Okay. Was that a question, or I'll take that as a comment?
You can take it however.
Thank you, sorry. Another question.
I'd like to also follow up on the previous question about safety. The length of hours that the parking permit restrictions were suggested is 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. 7 days a week. How anyone can possibly be safe walking home or cycling home from public transport after dark in any of this municipality is beyond me, and you can probably take that as a comment as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, so thank you for that comment and feedback. John Stall-Wixon. Sorry, John Stall-Wixon. Is Mr. Stall-Wixon here? No? Andrea McIntyre? Look, I think there was a question about why is there no mention of the parking strategy in the Darebin newsletter, and it's worth noting that Council's previous newsletter, so not the one that's arrived in people's letterbox in the last week, did actually talk about the parking strategy consultation that was coming up. Because it was likely that the current newsletter would arrive once the consultation was almost complete, it wasn't included in this newsletter because it had been included in the previous one. So that explains why you might have been expecting to see it in this newsletter and didn't. Just allow me to find my next sheet and make sure that I don't miss anyone. I've got another question from Andrea McIntyre, but Ms McIntyre's not here. No, I've got Tony Trapani. Mr. Trapani here? Welcome.
G'day, I'm Tony Trapani. I'm from Northcote 3070. I think you've partially answered these questions already, but going forward, if this policy is removed or the strategy is removed, how does the council make a decision on changes to street parking, and is that posted somewhere on a website? Do we know before it happens that it's going to happen, I suppose?
Thank you, Mr. Trapani, for that question. Council has been making decisions based on resident feedback and petitions, which I've previously outlined. Council does not have a website that it posts changes that are occurring to street signs or parking restrictions. However, affected households are notified in writing and their feedback is requested prior to any restriction change.
Could the council take under advisement maybe to consider having a website just for transparency to allow us to see what's actually going on?
I'll take that on notice and refer that idea to the CEO. Thank you.
Just a supplementary there.
Sorry, I don't want you to ask supplementaries if you've got, because I know you've got a second.
Well, it's adding on the same thing. So if we don't want the parking restrictions, can we come to you and say we don't want the restrictions that have been put in our streets? So
yes, absolutely, absolutely. So council the process has always been that those restrictions, by and large, have been initiated by residents. So
either way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Marina Crane.
Hi, Marina Crane, 3073. First question, areas with congestion issues are also areas with multi-level apartments or multi-unit townhouse developments. Why have or are builders exempt from providing appropriate parking for each apartment, and why? You sort of touched on it earlier, but you know, if you've got an apartment building where there already is congestion, why aren't they forced to provide parking?
Okay. For those who aren't familiar with the planning scheme, apartment buildings with 1 or 2 bedrooms are typically required to provide 1 car park, and apartments with 3 bedrooms or more are required to provide 2 car parks. So that's the sort of essential plus visitor car parking, but that there are exemptions in the planning scheme if they're in major transport corridors. So there are quite tight guidelines that aren't Darebin Council guidelines, they are Victorian State Planning guidelines. So multi-level apartments and townhouse developments must meet the requirements of the Victorian Planning Scheme, which includes providing appropriate car parking, and I just outlined what that appropriate car parking is.
That's sort of not really happening. It's not.
I'll keep answering.
It's not. That's why I'm asking.
So that's the second part. It's open for developers to seek to provide less parking than is outlined in the planning scheme, but to do so, developers have to apply for a planning permit and provide evidence that there is still an appropriate number of car parking and that what we're seeking doesn't adversely affect the neighbourhood. When it makes planning decisions, council is required to make decisions in accordance with the planning scheme, and council decisions are subject to appeal at VCAT. One of the sources of data that is used for determining the amount of car parking is census data, which actually shows how many car parks are being used in apartment buildings. And typically what we actually know from the census is that some of the car parking in those apartment buildings is unoccupied and is not being used. So developers rely on that data when they say they want to provide less. So we actually know there are empty car parks in apartment buildings, and that may be because some people are choosing to park on the street and not in their off-street parking.
Okay, my second question is in regards to the Preston Market. What is the council's view on development of this site, and will it provide the same number of free parking spots that there is now, and if not, why not?
Thank you for that question. Council is currently consulting with the community on the future planning controls for the Preston Market. 2 of the draft principles approved by the Minister for Planning and endorsed by Council relate to parking and transport, and it's certainly been our position that parking should be available. Obviously that site is privately owned and it's not a council site. Thank you for those questions. Lisa Smith of High Street, or Lise A. Smith, I may have that written down wrong, so if that might be you. No. Marita Brasher of Clark Street, no. Juliet Hall. Welcome, Juliet.
Juliet Hall, my postcode's 3070. Thank you for listening this evening. I received a flyer to my Northcote High Street business prior to the release of the parking strategy, which indicated council was planning to introduce paid parking to local shopping areas in Darebin. The parking strategy doesn't list any detail about that. Does council or does the strategy have a plan to introduce paid parking to local shopping areas? And the second part of that question is, if council does intend to introduce paid parking, what, if any, economic assessment has been made on the effect of that on small businesses in Darebin, both long and short term?
Thank you for that question, Juliet. The strategy, which is a draft, said that paid parking would be considered for investigation. So there wasn't a plan to implement it, there was a plan to consult about that. Funding has been allocated in the 1920 draft budget for investigation of technology, but the investigation hasn't been done and there are no specific plans.
Okay. So people come to local shopping areas to be part of a wider, vibrant community, and we really feel that the introduction of paid parking would detrimentally affect that feeling of community, and traders and small business owners are very fearful that business could go from the local areas to the larger shopping centres. You talked about the parking sensor technology. Would it be possible for that suggested technology to be used for monitoring paid parking?
I'd have to take that on notice, but certainly there has not been any decision in relation to putting in paid parking.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
or sensors, either.
No decision on census. I was in
No, we were going to explore all the options. You know, we're aware that many traders are actually asking us to make sure that there are ways of ensuring people don't overstay so that there's turnover. And sometimes census can be used with or without paid parking, but that was for
already
to investigate all the options and to look at that. So no, there's not. So, you know.
So the 400,000 in the budget is just for investigation, not for any actual.
I'll refer that to the CEO. I'll refer that to the CEO for more detail about that.
Yeah,
certainly.
Through you, Mayor. Thanks for the question. Right. So the money that's in the draft budget is allocated for a range of reasons that are parking related, not just the investigation of enforcement measures or compliance measures. In the event that Council supports the strategy and was, decided to go ahead, we would then need to look at the next phase of that. So we don't have a view on technology at this point, and we need to research that obviously and prepare business cases. Some of that money in the draft budget was indicated for that purpose. If Council makes a different decision, then they'll obviously have to make a different decision about the allocation of that funding. There are other elements of that, which is about maintaining the existing compliance requirements that we already have. And ongoing rolling changes that occur just as part of the natural cycle right throughout the city. So at any given time, there's quite a lot of activity and upgrading of signs and replacement of signs right across the city in any sort of asset management. So it's a bundled number that is a bit hard to sort of specifically unpick for the purpose of tonight. I'm very happy to speak with you separately, but some of that was for the investigation of technology. Yeah.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian Rowe. No. Shelley Anderson. Welcome.
Shelley Anderson, 3070. I'm the president of the Northcote Traders Association. As everyone can imagine, the parking has a significant impact on our livelihoods. Juliet asked a question that I was considering, but one of the things I'd like to find out is the document states that there will be an increase in population in Darebin of 64,800 people over 20 years, and as a result will require an extra 41,000 car parks. But no explanation as to how you've calculated that number is provided in that document. Your only reference is that it's on current behaviours and trends continue, yet this is the premise for your whole strategic review in relation to the growth of population and cars. Could you please explain how you came to that? Because, I certainly think that that's worthy of knowing.
Thank you for that question, Ms Anderson. As your question and some of the subsequent questions that I've got were received after 3 p.m, we haven't got answers prepared, so I'll take that on notice and make sure that we do get an answer back to you. I have a question from Chris Erlinson also.
Chris Erlinson, 3072. My first question is in relation, I guess it's been partially asked, but in terms of retail and trade, the activity centres, and in particular Preston Central and specifically Preston Market, can you guarantee that this strategy will not kill retail?
Thank you for that question. Obviously, the future of this strategy will be determined by the debate that is going to be had later tonight. As I previously stated, Council is working with the VPA, who are the responsible authority in terms of long-term future of the Preston Market site, and Council has made it very clear that car parking is of significance to the future of that site and its viability.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah. Okay. I had a number of people who wanted to ask questions and submitted their questions online, but who weren't here when I called out their name. I'll try again now, and if you did submit a question and haven't had an opportunity to ask that question, I'll then ask who's there. So, So George Abionis, no. Simon Mackey. Fran Martin. Jennifer Tran. Julia Scott. Zihad Nicholas. Kate Broder. Frank Areno.
Some of them need to be calling and next door.
Okay. Okay, we have some people next door, some of those people who are expecting to make a question. We'll stop the clock, we'll make sure that we don't count down, and we'll get those people and ensure they have an opportunity to ask their question. Sorry, I wasn't aware there were people next door. I'm not sure why they're not in here. We'll just make sure that they get in here.
We'll just wait for a minute.
We're already in here. We want to ask a question. We've asked to come.
Okay, I'm sorry if there's been...
Oh no, these are the people who didn't submit.
So the people here that had submitted questions that were in next door.
Yeah, okay, I'll check.
Apologies for this delay. We do want to make sure that every person who has submitted a question does have an opportunity to ask that question. So, while we're waiting, is there anybody in the room who did submit a question online and whose name I haven't called out? No.
In the hall now.
Okay, well...
Keep going through the list because there's no one.
I'm on the list.
No, there's no one in next door that submitted a question online. So I think...
So we're just going to double check that people who weren't here earlier are still not here. And then I will open to further questions. So John Stall, Wixon, John Stall Wixon. And Ian Rowe. And Marina Brasher. No. Okay. That brings us to the end of questions that were received online from people who are here tonight. I'd now like to invite people to come up, noting that it is council practice that questions that are received on the night without notice are heard and taken on notice. So I would invite you to come up, but please be aware that you may not get an answer to your question tonight. It will be taken. Yeah. Yeah. So there was someone up the back and someone on the side. Please come up. Maybe if you'd like to ask a question, you could actually stand on the side so we can move people. Yeah. If you have already asked questions, please don't come up and ask more because you are only allowed 2 questions. So please state your name and your suburb.
I'm Simon Lusted. I'm from Northcote 3070. Given the parking strategy and consultation process has gone on for some time now, 2 years by my reckoning, how did it get this far without council or the consultants realising the obvious degree of overwhelming resistance and anxiety in the community? Are there interim reports by consultants that can be publicly reviewed from the consultation process? Why did early consultations appear to fail or not be representative? What has council learned?
Thank you for that question about the consultation process. Please. Obviously, the consultation process has been going on for some time, and we'll take that on notice in terms of a more full rundown. But I would just say that the earlier parts of the consultation focused on the aims and things that were trying to be achieved through a parking strategy and looked at data collection and looked at how we prioritise use of road space. So it wasn't until much later stages in the development that a more specific process relating to implementation came up. And I think it's that process around implementation which has caused such high levels of concern and feedback. So thank you. Can I invite the next person to come up?
Hello, thank you for listening. My name's Anisha Lemaire and I'm at Northcote 3070. My question was around the actual specifics of the restrictions. So I wondered how the 2 hours, both sides of the street, over basically all waking hours from 8 a.m. until 11 p.m. was reached and who those 2 hours are for. So in my street, that wouldn't serve residents, it wouldn't serve people going by train, it wouldn't serve the people visiting the local oval, it wouldn't serve cleaners working a standard 3 hours, it wouldn't serve share households living there. And I was wondering who exactly, for in my street, like many other streets, the 2 hours would be like a no standing sign.
Okay, thank you. Please, I would ask, there's a lot of people here. I know that many of you fully support and want to applaud questions. It slows us down and I'm conscious there's a lot of people who would like to ask questions. So I would ask you to refrain from that. And I will refer that question to Ms Olivia, who's the General Manager of that area, for response.
And one further question, for people who have unusual circumstances where they're really very much in need of something that's outside the current plan, is there a system where those people can apply for something?
So one of the purposes of putting out a draft and requesting feedback is that it is a consultation. We're seeking to get feedback and hear about those situations so that we could make sure that the strategy was appropriate.
Yep. Thank you.
I'll refer your earlier question to Ms Olivier.
Thank you.
Is that working? Yep, excellent. So in regards to 2 hour restrictions, I guess there's, there are several different approaches you can take to restrictions, and so the proposal that's been developed is one that's very similar to one that Moreland have recently considered and put through. And so on balance, this is, it's tricky to find an approach to restrictions that works for visitors and businesses and residents, and so this is the one that we decided to test with the community.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. Can I invite the next person to come up?
Hello, my name's Annalisa and I'm a trader from Fairfield in 3078. I have 2 questions for you. In relation to development and parking with the census results, in relation to buildings such as Nightingale in Fairfield, could Council please clarify how the apartments were permitted to be built without car spaces, especially now that the restrictions that are being placed forward put more pressure on the local area? And secondly, exclusively speaking about Fairfield and the trading area, if the parking that we currently have isn't being monitored and policed properly, what is the point in extending the zone and the restrictions only to cause more grief for residents and traders in the area?
Thank you for those 2 questions. Please, I did ask... take it on. Yeah. You want me to answer it? Yeah. The Nightingale development was approved a number of years ago. It has been developed by a group who do a number of similar developments, including a number in Brunswick. They're apartments that are specifically designed for owner-occupiers who don't own a car, and they have a wait list of people wanting to actually purchase into those developments. So the model has been very successful in Moreland in Brunswick. People who move in don't have cars. a few of us actually made a visit to that development recently and heard that the people who are moving in don't have cars. So I think that there is a place for people who have never had a car and may not have a licence to be actually able to buy an owner-occupied building where they are looking for other things, other features. So it's not a typical model that we see. It's the only such building in Darebin, and it was also approved at VCAT on appeal. So, sorry, there was another one about enforcement. I'll refer that one to the CEO because that's an operational matter. Okay, thank you.
Through you, Mayor. Thank you for the question. In terms of, you're absolutely right, Council needs to make sure it can enforce parking restrictions where they're implemented. And so this strategy, as the community know and Council know, this strategy was released as a draft, and in the event that it progresses, then what Council would then need to do is work out how it would adequately resource compliance, because the intent is that if you put in restrictions, then you enforce them and you cause the turnover. That's something, in terms of the current arrangements, there's no doubt that we're a bit stretched at the moment in terms of compliance, and that's something I have to talk to Council about separately, but we work really hard to make sure that we provide good coverage of the city and we try to treat all of the areas fairly, but it's a bit of an ongoing discussion.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'd like to move to extend question time by 30 minutes.
Okay, moved by Councillor Newton, seconded by Councillor Messina. All those in favour? That motion is carried. So we have moved another continuance, so we'll be able to keep hearing the questions. I'd invite the next person to come up and ask a question.
Terry Lagozzo, 3070 Northcote. I have two questions. I'd like to preface my questions by saying that I think the Darebin car parking strategy is draconian, unfair, and if it was implemented, it would force many people who've been a long-time residents of this area, it'd force them out of their properties. I want to put that on the record.
Sorry, keep going. I will ask once again, and your question. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I have two questions specifically. What evidence will the council provide of all streets which have been nominated within this 400-metre zone of High Street and of train stations? What evidence will council provide all residents of what actually is the car congestion? Where I live in Park Street, near Hartigan Street, near Aberdeen Grove, near Gordon Grove, every day there's untaken parking in the street. There's just no congestion. So my specific question is, will the council provide all residents within these zones of the details of what is the alleged parking congestion in their streets? Because as I just said, around my area, it's very easy to find a car spot, and I know people in the opposition Facebook group have sent in photos of streets which don't have, a lot of cars in them. So what evidence will be provided to individuals in these 400-metre zones of each street of congestion?
Yep.
Okay. My second question is, excluding Melbourne City Council, has any other council adopted a similar parking strategy to what has been proposed by Darebin Council? And if not, can one conclude that it's draconian and unfair and unreasonable?
Thank you for those questions. I'm going to refer the question to Ms Olivier to answer.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. We've certainly collected data for occupancy on much of the area where restrictions were proposed, not all of the area. Happy to step anyone through the detail of that. The way we did that was on a Thursday and a Saturday to try and test both daytime parking occupancy as well as evening parking occupancy from sort of 1 in the afternoon through to 10 at night. The other thing that the team have considered is that when there's acute parking pressure and you introduce restrictions, what tends to happen is you move where people park out. So it's not So they've been thinking about a whole area, not just an individual street. There are a couple of, in regards to the other question about are there other similar approaches in Melbourne? Yes, there are. I would say Moreland is the other example that you would look to.
Port
Phillip.
Yep. Okay, thank you. There's a little bit of noise. I know some people have come in. Please take a seat if you can see one, and please do try and keep the noise down so that everybody can hear the questions and the answers that are provided. Yep. Because of the number of people still wanting to ask a question, please just ask your question as briefly as possible without a preamble. Carolyn, you next in line.
Very quick. Carolyn Lunt, 3070. And this is two questions, brief questions about the climate emergency. Can councillors please explain what the connection is between the parking strategy and the climate emergency plan? That's the first question. Second question, where is it in the climate emergency plan that discouragement of private vehicle use is recommended? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Ms Lunt. I won't be able to go into full detail because I don't have the actual documents in front of me to review the parts. We have looked at where emissions are occurring, and transport is a major source of emissions in Darebin. So we'll take that on notice. Thank you. Next, please.
Please state your name and postcode.
Dermot Hannigan, 3070. In developing this new parking strategy for Darebin, has Council considered its obligations under the Victorian Charter of Human Rights? Because they are taking an existing right off the residents of Northcote, and we will have to pay for fees and be subjected to the tyranny of parking officers.
Thank you for that question. Yes, Council did examine a wide range of human rights issues. Both the consultation plans and the draft proposals were considered through these lenses. If you have any questions about specific aspects of the proposals and how they relate to human rights officers, would be happy to discuss that with you. Thank you.
How much money are you going to make out of our community by implementing this strategy?
The proposals in the strategy around parking permit costs, which were the only things in the draft that were suggested, were a partial cost recovery of the cost of implementing a parking permit strategy. So this strategy was not, the draft that was out was never about raising revenue for council. Ask for the next person to come up.
Karen Danakis, 3070 in Northcote. With regards to the 400 metres, specifically at Dennis train station, the 400 metres goes beyond the allocation of where the parking, 2-hour parking restrictions is. So I've only looked at my particular area. So I have two questions. One is, how many other train stations are affected by beyond the 400 metres, and why are those streets included beyond the 400 metres if it's only 400 metres? And the second question is, how do I get to enjoy social events such as going to the football at the MCG, going to the cinema and doing shopping in the city if I'm restricted by 2 hours, especially on the weekends, if it's from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m? And if the aim is to reduce driving, parking at a train station for 2 hours, I'm unable to achieve that.
Thank you for those questions. I'll take them partially as comments, noting that this was a consultation or is it...
Sorry, I do have a question as to how did streets beyond the 400 metres get included?
Okay, I'll ask Ms Olivia to respond to that question. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. Essentially, we've tried to communicate clearly to people, which we've provided a map of where the proposed boundaries are, and they're approximately that distance from the shopping strips, but it's...
Sorry, I'd ask the audience, please do not comment. It slows things down. Lots of people have questions and we will try and get them all answered.
So for a specific area, it is worth looking at the map, and if there are specific questions about why in that particular area that was chosen, we're really happy to answer them.
Okay. Well, if you look at the map, most of them are beyond the 400 metres. And the second question is, how do we get to enjoy social events when there's a 2-hour parking restriction at train stations?
I'll take that as feedback. We've had much similar feedback, and that's why this was a consultation process. So please be assured that in the process of consulting, we were open to hearing feedback such as yours, and we have heard that clearly. Thank you. Next person, please.
Good evening, Diana Pays, Reservoir 3073. It's in reference to obviously the exclusion zones and inclusion zones. I have received confirmation from Council that the parking restrictions with regard to stations is the responsibility to provide sufficient car parks to the commuters. I am a resident as well as a commuter. So will Council, local government, be petitioning state government for allocated funds to accommodate parking at venues such as railway stations that people use to commute to and from work, and events and social activities?
Thank you for that question, Diana. I'll also refer that to Ms Olivier. We may have to take it on notice if we can't provide an answer, which would mean that we'd get back to you in writing. Yeah, sorry, we will get back to you in writing on that. Yeah, okay. Thank you. I'll ask the next person to come up.
Hi, my name is Adrienne Fitch. I live in Northcote 3070. I would like to give an example of my street. During the day, there's barely any cars in my street. After 3:30, we get some parents come home and they're in the street. At night, the street is full. There's only parking on one side and it's full. It's all residents. With the proposed parking strategy, nothing will change. Those residents will need to get parking permits. So instead of, I don't understand what this parking policy is doing except charging us more money to do what we do today. There is no issue on my street, there's no issue on many streets. What is the purpose of this strategy? In simple terms.
Thank you for that question.
I have two.
Okay.
Did you want to answer that one?
Continue with your...
Okay. The second question is due to already restrictive parking in Preston. I caught a train here tonight. It took me an hour. Driving is 20 minutes. I've got 2 young boys at home that are cooking their own dinner. I've got a 3rd young boy travelling from Toorak, where he has his language school, that is usually collected by me. How are you going to improve the lighting around stations, including Clifton Hill, which is not in your jurisdiction and so out of your control, so that I can travel home safely tonight?
Thank you for those questions and that comment, please. In relation to safety and lighting, Council has recently undertaken a significant mapping and survey exercise to actually identify places where people don't feel safe.
All the way through the zone 1 and 2 that you are proposing. My house is 700 metres from...
Sorry.
Less than 800 metres from Fairfield, and it is the most of the way home.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. We do work closely through the Metropolitan Transport Forum to look at issues such as safety all around the public transport network across the whole of Melbourne. We did also undertake a recent Darebin-wide survey to locate places where people felt less safe in the municipality. So thank you for your questions tonight. Thank you for coming.
Hi, I'm Liz Schroeder from Thornbury 3071. I wanted to ask why the council flyer has only gone to residents in areas where the parking restrictions would apply, when all residents, including residents outside those areas, would also be impacted, for example, by not being able to park at the station for more than 2 hours, or by the overflow parking that would move into the streets adjacent to the parking areas where parking would be restricted. That's my first question. My second one is the proposed strategy would discriminate against families with young children, people with mobility issues, older residents who might not have the capacity to walk the distances that would be imposed by this strategy, people concerned about their safety, for example. How were these discriminatory aspects taken into account when the proposed strategy was developed, and how will council guard against this discrimination should the parking strategy be introduced?
Thank you for those questions. In relation to the consultation letter that was sent out to people within the identified zone, that was not the only form of communication with people. We actively went out to the media to make sure that people did hear about the consultation and knew that there was an opportunity to make comment. We also used social media and newsletters and other ways of actually engaging with people to ensure that people knew beyond the zone.
So I found out about it by word of mouth, so none of those methods reached me, and I'm not the only person. Nobody in my street knew about it. So
thank you, Liz. Thank you for that feedback. I do hear you, and obviously we'll take that back for consideration next time. The letterbox drop specifically went to those areas where we knew people would be impacted most directly because it was their streets in question. Yes, I'll ask the next person to come up. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sarah, Northcote 3070. I just want to follow up on a gentleman's request about the equations for revenue raising from fines. I know permits were mentioned, but what about the long-term revenue from the council for fines?
Look, I haven't seen modelling in relation to long-term fines. I'd have to refer that
you'd be willing to put together?
I'd have to refer that to the CEO. Certainly at the moment, the fine revenue, I don't believe it actually covers the cost of the program. So at the moment, parking officers cost us money, don't make us money, just to be very clear about that.
And with the new proposals, you predict that will be the same?
I'll refer that to the CEO.
Through you, Mayor, thank you for the question. It really depends on what council determines. So if council decided to proceed with the whole of the proposal, then that would be, that we could model what estimated income might be from fines. If council decided not to proceed with the proposal, then the same situation that exists today would exist. So it really depends on what happens this evening, to be honest. Traditionally, though, it's really very rare for parking income to be greater than the cost of running the parking service. So just in terms of the nature of the cover and the staffing costs. The other thing is that with every, so if you get a parking fine, for example, and you don't pay that on time, there's a cost escalation like there is with most fines. That is not money that council collects. That goes into a centralised state government process. So, but we have to administer that on behalf of the state. So, until it's clear what council, I guess in a nutshell, until it's clear what council intends to do with the strategy, I wouldn't be able to indicate what the cost versus the income would be. But if council proceeds, once I've got clarity on that, then that's something that I can provide some projections on.
Thank you. And secondary to that, following up on another resident's comment, what does the council propose to do to offset the risk of people walking home at night at risk of their safety?
Thank you. I might refer that also to one of the officers.
Through you, Mayor, thank you for the question. Quite apart from this strategy, discussion about improving community safety in the sense of community safety is something that council and council staff talk about a lot. I don't think there would be anyone in this room that isn't sort of conscious of that issue no matter where they live. So what we do try to do, we have a whole team that are dedicated to this topic, community safety and perceptions of safety, because sometimes perceptions are real, even when areas are quite safe, and it's very difficult also to prevent, so sometimes very unexpected and very, tragic things happen, even in the best urban design environments. So that's the reality of it. In the event that, so that's an ongoing piece of work for us. So we're constantly looking at the community and the environment, and we take every opportunity we can. So, for example, with the redevelopment of the level crossings, so the removal of the level crossings, one of the things that we're working really hard with the state government is to make sure that in removing those level crossings and rebuilding stations such as at Preston and Reservoir, that we take the opportunity to encourage the state and in fact, in Reservoir, we've done quite a lot of work to improve the circumstances of Reservoir Station in terms of community safety by making sure that there's a visible line between the two sections of the centre, making sure that there's good lighting and activation on the train station site. So we try to use every discussion we have in terms of those changes that occur gradually to address community safety amongst other things. So it's something that's never far from our mind, and it would be something that if this strategy was supported by council and there was a specific issue that needed to be addressed, then of course we would need to address that.
Thank you for those questions, Sarah. I'll invite the next person up.
Hi, my name's Michael Bernardio. I'm a resident, Gadd Street, Northcote.
Welcome.
I was going to ask a number of questions here tonight, but everyone seems to be beating me to the punch. Everyone's got the same concerns about safety. This has been going on for about an hour and a half, question time. And can I just make a statement instead of a question?
I'm sorry, we aren't. The local law doesn't
turn it into
allow
a question.
for statements. Yeah, thank you.
Does the council think that it should maybe end this discussion this evening, stop wasting people's times and throw this parking strategy in the rubbish bin where it deserves to be? Because I would like to know if there was a benefit in this parking strategy. How do I, who live 75 metres from a train station, what do I say to my two grown-up boys' girlfriends who come and stay overnight when they have to go and move their car 400 metres away? What do they do about safety?
Okay.
There's a question there.
Thank you for those questions. In relation to the question as to whether we move to a discussion about the strategy, we made a decision that it was important to hear from all the community members who have a question. We can extend the time or we can not extend the time. There's not a huge number of people here. I think there's another 5 people or 6 people that I can see. In fairness to those people who've been waiting, I'd like to offer them an opportunity to also ask their question, but I would ask that you make the questions short. Obviously, there's a lot of people who have taken time out of their evening tonight and who want us to get to the debate on the motion with regards to the future of the strategy. In relation to the question about safety, we've had a few answers already on the issue of safety and some of the work that council does, so I don't think I can add more to that at the moment, but we're certainly able to provide further information later. So I'll invite the next person to come up, please.
Hi, my name's Lou, 3072. We got a business down in Preston, and we're just finding that if you guys extend these parking, it's just going to affect every retail business in the area, like it or lump it. Because look what's happened down Bridge Road, what's happened down Chapel Street. Now, all you guys are going to do is just going to keep pushing people further out. Now, if the council probably didn't allow, putting no parking for certain properties, you wouldn't have this problem. So I think the council's actually contributed to the problem that we have at the moment.
Okay. Thank you. I'll take that as a comment. Thank you, Lou. I would remind people, though, that this is question time and we're not able, under the local law, to take submissions on items that are on the agenda.
Peter Gonis, 3073. How many people have been consulted regarding the parking strategy? Do you have numbers?
Yes, we do have numbers. I don't have them in front of me. There's absolutely thousands of people who have participated in the consultation process, and we can certainly get a further breakdown in the future. The process is ongoing, so there isn't a process. The process is ongoing, and at this point there is a week to go on that process.
In regards to the lady's question before, I have the sense that the answer was the council's not really going to make any money out of this parking strategy. If so, why go ahead?
Council has put out a draft parking strategy in recognition of the significant parking pressures that we are already facing in this municipality, demand from residents for us to actually do something about congestion in some streets. And yes, I did say some streets, and as part of the consultation process, we've certainly had a lot of feedback about streets that should be included and streets that shouldn't be included. So we know that the parking pressure we currently experience is going to grow in the future for a whole range of reasons. The main one being that Melbourne as an entire city is growing very significantly. That's not just something that's happening in Darebin. So thank you for those questions. I'll invite the next person to come up.
Tony Sullivan, 3073. My property is 800 metres plus from the railway line, 1.2 kilometres from Reservoir Station, and it is included in your 2-hour parking strategy. Can you explain to me why this is so?
Okay, thank you. I will just say that nothing in Reservoir was actually included for any implementation in the foreseeable future. That was actually, the blue zone was for further investigation in relation to looking more closely at those areas in the future. Ms. Olivia, do you have anything to add to that? No?
I was just going to say that we could have a conversation about the specific location if that's of interest.
Okay, so we'll actually be able to have a specific conversation about that particular location, but the areas that were marked in blue were for consideration or investigation at a later date, as opposed to implementation.
That is not how your documentation that arrived in my letterbox came through. It clearly said 2019 second half for the whatever Thornbury zone is, and then we were next cab off the rank late 2019, 2020.
My understanding, and I don't have the paper in front of me, was that it read that it was for further investigation. I apologise if that's not what appeared to you, and I'll ask Miss Olivier. I do hear what you're saying, that that's not how you read that. Okay, thank you.
Question number 2 refers to your interactive map, which appears on your website, which actually does show that my area is going to be affected, and that areas outside that, if you click on the individual addresses, they are for further consultation. Why have those people not been involved in the outset of this strategy?
Okay, I'll refer that to Ms. Olivier, and we may actually speak to you about that particular area because I can't, picture it on the map at the moment.
Mayor Rennie, I can't add much to the specifics. I'm really interested in that feedback. I've heard similar before, and I would always hope that we're getting that stuff right, but I would love the opportunity to follow up and understand if there's an error or not,
okay,
or to explain it.
Thank you. I think we have one final person who has a question, so
Nick Katz's 3071. I've got a couple of questions. Namely for transparency, are we able to access the data pertaining to the consultation process that was supposedly undertaken? I have grave concerns about the data itself and whether it was for vested purposes. So is that open to the community?
So the question was in relation to the consultation data that's already been collected, whether that's available to the community.
Yes.
So there hasn't been any analysis yet of the data.
So how do we get to our
You're talking about, well, the data, I mean, the data from the last 3, are you talking about the data from the last 3 weeks or earlier data?
Well, the data that's been collated to get to this point. So it's got to be a collective.
Okay, so some of the earlier data that was collected in previous rounds of consultation. Yeah, okay, sorry. we can provide that. Sure.
And secondly, I'm not going to make this political because I am a former councillor of Darebin, but I will raise, last election or federal election, there's been a 13.4% swing against the Greens. Can I quantify potentially for people that are here, when are we going to have a Greens agenda not shoved down our throats, because this reeks of a Greens agenda?
I'd ask people...
I do not expect an answer on that, but I'm not going to keep quiet either.
Okay.
So
I'd ask you
speak to me later.
I think it's actually, as an independent councillor, I think it's inherently unhelpful to think of this as being political. I noted on the weekend that the city of Maribyrnong was mentioned in the paper as having similar issues. You know, they're obviously of a completely different political persuasion. Parking is very tricky wherever it occurs in any municipality. We have heard a lot of feedback. I don't think anything in the proposal of the strategy was inherently political or driven by anyone's belonging or not belonging to any political party. Now, people may believe that or not believe that as they see fit, but I think you only have to look at similar consultations and the sort of feedback that's occurred in the city of Port Phillip, in the city of Maribyrnong, in councils of all kinds of political persuasions to know that this is an issue that is difficult and complex wherever it occurs. So that brings us to the end of question time. I do apologise if some of my answers were brief. If you feel as though your question was only partially answered or want further information, please send me an email and I will ensure that you actually get that response. The downside of trying to keep the meeting brief and not make sure that we had a 3-hour question time was that I'm aware that some of the answers that I provided were brief, and I would encourage you, if you want some follow-up, to get in touch with me. So thank you to all the people who came with your questions, and thanks to everyone else for listening patiently. So we now move to petitions. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you everyone who's here with us tonight, including some who have both signed and also prepared some of these petitions that I'm going to present to Council. So there are 3 petitions which I'll present to Council, and I'll ask councillors in the gallery to bear with me as I just refer to what they include. The first one refers to paid street parking in Darebin. The petition is to reject any proposal to introduce paid parking to local shopping strips in Darebin. It includes 64 signatures, of which 13 are noted as traders. The second petition is in... should I do them one by one or one by one?
One by one.
So I move that that petition be provided to Council and that a report come back to Council in response to that petition as per the submitter's request.
So moved and seconded by Councillor Lasserf. All those in favour? That's carried.
Thank you. The second petition is in relation to paid street parking on Station Street, Fairfield. The petition is to withdraw the draft parking strategy 2019 to 2029 for paid parking and to engage in transparent, balanced consultation with residents, traders and shoppers before presenting an alternative strategy. That petition includes 60 signatures, of which there are 29 are noted as traders. So I'll move that, along lines of the previous petition that be presented to our officers for a report to come back to Council.
So moved and seconded by Councillor Williams. All those in favour? That is carried.
And thank you, Mayor. And the third petition is in relation to paid street parking from High Street, Westgarth through to Reservoir. The petition is to withdraw the draft parking strategy 2019 to 2029 for paid parking and to engage in transparent, balanced consultation with residents, traders and shoppers before presenting an alternative strategy. That includes 31 signatures. And I understand that Councillor Greco also has petitions in relation to the same item, so I'll move that those ones, that final one also be presented to Council officers for a report to come back to Council in due course.
So moved and seconded by Councillor Messina. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. Any other petitions? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I have a petition which has been handed to me by some members of the Neighbours Against Darebin Parking Strategy. And I have a number of petitions. I have 442 actual petitions, but also been informed that there are 6,830 online petitions. I actually don't have those here with me, but I would invite the petition holders to submit those to council for the sake of the record. I'll read out what this petition says. This petition says that we, the undersigned residents, traders of Spencer Street and surrounding streets of Thornbury, petition Darebin to 1. Withdraw the draft parking strategy 2019 to 2029, and 2. To engage in transparent, balanced consultation with residents before presenting an alternative strategy. So I submit that strategy, I submit this petition and move it, and ask that the CEO consider the petition and provide an appropriate response.
So moved. Thank you, Councillor Greco, and seconded by Councillor Williams. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Councillor Messina.
I also have a petition that I noted that received and referred to the CEO for her consideration and response. It's a residential parking permit scheme. We are the underside residents of 16 residents who reside in Morgan Street, Preston. Hereby petition Darebin Council to introduce time parking restrictions to our street. I noticed that this is due to congestion in the street. I submit this to the CEO for her consideration and response.
So moved. Thank you, and seconded by Councillor Williams. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Are there any other petitions? There being none, I'll move to urgent business. There is no urgent business, so that brings us to 10.1, the NOM.
Mayor, I move the motion and it'll come up on the board.
Yes,
it's slightly been altered. Some people already know, so I'll just let people have...
I'm happy to second it. Sorry, can we just take that version down maybe and put up a version that doesn't have track changes? Okay.
You may want to read it out because if people are online, they won't be able to see that. Is that okay?
It was sent late this afternoon, so... But if you like, I can read it out to make it easier for everyone.
I just had lines on. Anyway, we'll put it back up on the screen however it is. Councillor Greco is going to read it out too.
The officers.
That's it. Thank you, Councillor Greco. It's on the screen. Can you read it from there, or would you like
me
to? So that's
I move that motion.
Moved by Councillor Greco and seconded by Councillor Williams. Okay, Councillor Greco.
Okay, and thank you, Mayor Rennie. Look, I'm really pleased to move this motion, and before I even start, I'd just like to thank the community for their mighty effort in getting their voices heard by council. The grassroots organisation and mobilisation is quite formidable, and it's something that Darebin as a community should be proud of, that their community actually gets involved when things count. So well done to the community from the outset. Also, it's a very intelligent campaign, and like we heard tonight, lots of intelligent and very particular questions in relation to the strategy. I'll just run through a few things. I only have 3 minutes. I'll run through a few things. I think we have to admit as a council when we get things wrong, and I believe in this particular case we have got it absolutely wrong, and we have to have the courage to admit that. Also, I would say, as a councillor, that we should not have let this process go as far as it actually did go. This parking strategy did come to council briefings. I'm not privy to disclose what is said in council briefing, but all I will say is that myself and maybe one or two other councillors did express concern about the policy. The other thing too that needs to be said is that a blanket approach does not work in our city. As we heard tonight with all the questions, that we need a much more articulated strategy, and a strategy that deals with the problems as they arise. So in terms of the concerns that have been raised, I won't go through them. We received literally dozens and dozens of emails from residents, but this I've never seen in the 10 years that I've been on council, 11 years or nearly council, so many questions being asked, and also so many people being been affected by affected families, shopkeepers, the vulnerable, the aged, safety for women, which was mentioned tonight, public transport, commuters, and even it's affecting also Preston Market that was mentioned here tonight. The concerns that I had at the outset when this policy came through me, and I aired these concerns, were particularly around parking around stations. I mean, it's just a dead no-brainer that if we want to encourage people to use public transport, we should not limit the parking around stations. And secondly, also about the big free kick that this policy will provide for developers, where they would not have to provide any parking for new development. So in relation to the motion that I'm putting forward, I'm asking that one is that we cease the consultation process. Many people have said that the consultation has been biased. Also that we withdraw the policy and we go back to the current approach, which is a street-by-street approach. And also thirdly is that we communicate to everyone what the decision that Council makes here today, so that everyone is absolutely clear where we're going with this policy.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I'll now invite Councillor Williams.
I appreciate the community that has gone to the effort and trouble raising their concerns, fears and tribulations regarding the Darebin car parking strategy. There were many unanswered questions and concerns from traders, commuters, parents, tradespeople, home carers, therapists, visitors, elderly, disabled, residents that have recently rebuilt their homes. Apologies for anybody that I've missed. If the strategy were to be endorsed, vibrant shopping strips may have been closed their doors because customers and consumers will find it difficult to shop, eat, attend appointments, or have therapists, family and friends visit in fear they will overstay. Finding staff to work at such places, including Darebin Council staff, that are unable to find all-day parking will have to move their vehicle every 2 hours from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. 7 days a week. The proposed strategy will impact on services and delivery to residents that will fail to meet community expectations. What about the severity impact during and after the construction of the elevated rail and the LXRA works? We certainly don't know if there will be more or less car parking spaces available once it's completed. Females will feel vulnerable if they have to walk further distance to or from their vehicles. I'm the only councillor that has personally experienced having parking permits in my street. The most stressful part was remembering to retract my visitor's car park from the visitor. In order to rebuild the faith for those that work, live and play in Darebin, this strategy needs to be scrapped and thrown in the dustbin immediately. It is paramount that this strategy like this involves years of community consultation that brings the whole of the community on that journey, ensuring to receive all critical information before making community-changing decisions that will bear and have everlasting effects on future generations. I will continue to be a voice for the community and for the vulnerable residents, ensuring they continue to live independently with proper home care in their home, which is Councillor's biggest debate yet to be voted on in the chamber in the next coming months.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Firstly, I have 1 hour and 2 hour parking restrictions on my street. I want to thank each and every resident that has contacted us about the parking strategy via phone calls, emails, and at the community meeting last week. In my 3 years on council, this is the biggest community response to an issue I've seen. I've heard from and listened to dozens, perhaps hundreds of residents now on this topic. And what I've heard is that while Darebin is a wonderful united city of 150,000 people from Alphington to Keon Park, we are also a diverse city of individual needs with different needs from cradle to grave. Overwhelmingly, people told us how they care about the environment, aim to reduce car use and live the most sustainable lives they can. But at all stages of life, parents with babies and children, young people, parents with babies and children, young adulthood through to downsizing as people age, there are times people need to use cars. We heard about the grandparents that visit to care for their grandchildren, the apprentices who need their cars for their tools, the elderly Greek neighbours who cannot walk far and need to drive to avoid social isolation, the people who may be temporarily injured, the people that do not feel safe to walk home at night. We heard that you want to enjoy what our local restaurants, shops and nightlife has to offer. You want people to visit for your family dinners and special occasions. Darebin is a council that is bold and progressive. Our vision is for a greener, bolder, more connected city. We reflect the society we live in and represent. We're a council that listens and responds. This is why we're taking the unusual step of planning to cease this consultation and withdraw the draft strategy. We've heard you loud and clear.
10 seconds.
I stand with the residents of Darebin in supporting the motion to withdraw the draft parking strategy and cease the current consultation.
Thank you. Are there further speakers? Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. Over the past 3 weeks, I've engaged with over 300 residents in relation to emails, Facebook posts, tweets and phone calls. I'm struggling to find a similar time when one issue has raised so much interest. And I would support Councillor Greco's point. Over the past 10 years, I can't think of an issue that has raised this level of interest. But what is really important is actually that for a lot of the people that I've been speaking with and via email, this is actually their first engagement with the council strategy process. And I think it's important to show that this council listens. And I agree, we don't always get it right. Sometimes we get it spectacularly right, and you'll see on the agenda this evening how we're looking to do one of the most ambitious pieces of renewable energy of any council in the country. But on this issue, I think we've actually missed a point. And I think that one of the unusual things about this situation tonight is that we're stepping in because the resident feeling is so strong to say, actually, this strategy has no future. It actually needs to be stepped in very quickly by councillors to say, we don't want to proceed with this. So I thank Councillor Greco for taking on my additional amendments to refer to both traders and also to thank residents and traders for their contributions and to not seek a further report in relation to this because the message has been loud and clear. I also would hope that Council doesn't spend any more money on pursuing this draft parking strategy and that we would see that sort of money invested in things that support local mobility. To pick up on some of the issues that residents have raised, I've heard a lot from residents who talk about the inadequacy of the state-run public transport system, buses and trains not connecting, buses and trams not connecting, the simple things that make life hard when they should be easy. And that's the part of the work that Council, in fact, needs to do with the community. We've been doing it for a long time, but I think we can do more. I've also heard about PSOs who are not allowed to walk residents to their cars from train stations. These are the sorts of actions that I think Council can take. We've heard what you've said, and therefore I'm very, very pleased to support withdrawing the strategy and ceasing the consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there further speakers? Councillor Messina.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, I would like to vote in favour of the motion. Firstly, I want to echo the thank yous to our community as mentioned in the motion and extend my sincerest apologies for the unnecessary stress and anxiety it has ignited, especially to the disadvantaged and the vulnerable. I acknowledge that Darebin's parking issues need to be addressed. However, the proposed solution was not fair and equitable for our municipality. This draft strategy is a futuristic plan, perhaps a touch of George Orwell. It is not a realistic approach that addresses parking issues. It has numerous flaws, shortfalls, and is written to the point of confusion. It provides a blanket sledgehammer approach that does not allow for diverse circumstances. It is solely for the purpose of the change in mode of transportation. There is an implication and misconception by some that those who are against this draft strategy aren't environmentally conscious, and that in itself is insulting. For the purpose of the gallery, a councillor who questions a strategy or does not support a draft strategy doesn't necessarily have to move or second a motion. Questions asked by councillors during briefings are not documented. Facts for your consideration. Did you know that 3/4 of Melbourne do not live within 400 metres of a bus, a service which is crucial to any parking strategy, linking it to the railway infrastructure? We are in the process of major evolutionary change in Darebin. Reservoir, Bell, Kramer, Oakover and Murray Road railway crossings will be removed. Reservoir together with Preston and Bell Street will be developed or are currently underdeveloped. And of course we have the Preston Market redevelopment. A car parking strategy without these plans is the equivalent to a jigsaw puzzle with all the pieces which is disconnected. As elected representative, it will be remiss of us to ignore these facts. The draft strategy should not proceed, and councillors who fail to acknowledge this needs to explain this to their communities. I stand with the residents and business owners to withdraw that strategy.
Thank you. Are there further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried.
Mayor, can it be noted as a unanimous vote?
So we will certainly record that that was a unanimous decision of council. I would like to thank councillors, but more particularly I would like to thank all the members of our amazing community who participated in this consultation. I don't think we've ever had a consultation where as many people participated, and for those of you who have participated in a consultation for the first time, I do hope that it won't be the last time that you participate in one of our consultations, because our decision making will be better for your involvement and input. You are more than welcome to stay for the rest of the night, but feel free now to make your way home if you'd like to. We'll take a 2-minute break. Okay, I'll ask everybody who's remaining to be seated, please, because we're going to move on with the meeting. I did just say a 2-minute break to enable people to clear out of the room, but we won't hold things up further. I think we'll keep going with the meeting. We've still got 6 councillors around the table, so... So, councillors, we'll move now to consideration of reports, with the first report being 8.1, appointment of additional Darebin Women's Advisory Committee member. So we'll move for that. Moved by Councillor Amir, seconded by Councillor Messina.
Sorry, they'll just need to fill in the blank in the recommendation.
Yep, we do. So, that's right.
We'll read that. Hang on. So I move that Council appoints the following person to the Darebin Women's Advisory Committee, bringing the number of community members to 12, with that person being...
Samantha Young.
Samantha Young.
Thank you. And that's seconded by Councillor Messina. So, Councillor Amir.
So this is following on from our previous resolution where we appointed 11 members to the Women's Advisory Committee. There's 12 members allowed, and so I'm pleased that we now have the full cohort of 12 members, noting that Samantha will bring great experience both in her personal and professional life to the committee. I also want to say thanks again. I know we spoke about this last time, but really reinforcing my thanks to the community members who work hard on that committee supporting gender equality, and this staff working so hard in Darebin to support women's safety. I'm really proud of all the work we do here in Darebin supporting women, not just in women's safety in the street, but also reducing family violence, supporting women's leadership, supporting young women and gender diverse young people through the music program, supporting mothers. I think Darebin's a pretty great place to be a woman. I'm very happy to be living and working here. So yeah, thanks so much to the staff who've worked so hard and the community members outgoing and incoming, and congratulations Samantha and to the other members. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Messina.
Sorry, I just wanted to echo Councillor Amir's statement, and I also want to add that we were part of the gender equality map. So I'm very proud of that process. Shire of Melton and Darebin were chosen for that, and what that was a blanket audit for safety, in particular women. So I was very proud to stand and receive that the report in relation to that map.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. 8.2.
Mayor, I'll move that as an alternate motion.
Mayor, I'd like to declare a conflict.
Okay, so thank you. Apologies, Councillor Messina, you did indicate that before.
I'd like to declare a conflict as I'm currently employed in the aged care community and have been for 12 years, and my company that I work for was also involved in bulk funding, so I need to withdraw from the room.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Councillor Greco.
So I'll move 8.2 and there's an alternate motion which should come up on the screen soon.
Sorry, Councillor Greco, I think we're just getting that up.
Can I ask, Mayor, has this been circulated to councillors? I can't seem to find it, that's all.
If you like, I can read it out.
We'll have to, because it hasn't been circulated, we will have to get it up on the screen.
It was sent at 4:59. 4:59.
4:59.
So, just to explain, point 1 will remain the same, and it's an additional point to the recommendation that is there before us in the report. I just read it out. It's very simple and straightforward. I don't think it's too controversial. So that council write to the federal government requesting that they honour their commitment to extend the CHSP funding until June 2022 and consider extending funding indefinitely after that date. It's an additional point to the point that's already there.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I think it's okay. Yep. Councillor McCarthy, did you have a question?
Look, I don't have it. So, but I would like to know if officers have looked at this. I'd like to have an idea about the implications of this.
Thank you for that question. I'll just put that on hold while I seek a seconder for Councillor Greco's motion. Is there a seconder for Councillor Greco's motion? Thank you, Councillor Amir. Ms Henderson, I might pass to you for a response to Councillor McCarthy's question, which was about whether advice had been provided in relation to the addition that Councillor Greco is seeking to add.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, yes, I did provide a quick email back to councillors at about 5:10, I think, which is just, of course, it's open to council to pass that resolution. My advice is I very much doubt it will make any impact on what the federal government actually does, because they're already committed to extending to 2022, but it's absolutely open to council to vote that.
Thank you, and apologies that some of us hadn't had an opportunity to read that advice. Councillor Greco.
Do I have a seconder?
Yes, Councillor Amir has seconded it.
Thank you. Look, just firstly, before I go to my additional point, I'll just speak in relation to this report and what it says. Basically, this report is about authorising the CEO to sign up with the federal government in relation to the Commonwealth Home Support Program agreement in relation to a 1-year extension, which is already in the pipeline, and it's just a practical exercise here where we actually sign up to that 1-year extension to the 1st of July next year. But what is also happened, and that's quite obvious, and it's quite consistent with our advocacy in this space of making sure that council still continues to get funding in relation to the CHSP program. And I commend the officers for bringing this to our attention so we can ensure that we sign up and continue with the service. The second part of my amendment, of the motion there, is to take this as an opportunity to write to the federal government, again, reminding them that whilst they have announced an extension is on the cards to 2022, that they speed that up and make sure that they honour their commitment for that extension. Also, what the motion, the second part of the motion does is that, it takes this as an opportunity to advocate with the federal government that the funding needs to continue indefinitely beyond 2022. So, and I know and I appreciate the advice that we got from the officers, but I don't let any opportunity pass me by where we can actually advocate on such an important issue with the federal government. We just have to keep in their face, keep at it, not only with the extension to 2022, but the extension beyond 2022 on such a vital core council service.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Amir.
It's really great news, the federal government intending to provide block funding into the future, and really good to have this next year locked in as a formality, as is noted in the report and has been noted by Councillor Greco. This is absolutely consistent with Council's direction and advocacy and what we support. In regards to the letter to the Commonwealth, I suppose first thing on my mind is that federal government isn't really our biggest fan, so whether or not they're likely to respond favourably is probably neither here or there, but there's no harm in registering our support about the importance of continued block funding and the value of the services provided, which in this case is domestic and shopping assistance, personal care, respite and home maintenance, which is of course just part of the services that Darebin Council provides, and as we all know, we're working very hard considering and implementing the almost 100 recommendations from the age-friendly Darebin review, and looking forward to seeing more change and development support in this area. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Are there further speakers? Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Councillor Amir and Councillor Greco, for this motion, and I commend the additional point. I think we are probably all aware that this federal government made the decision that it did, obviously in a very particular political context, but the political context continues as long as we wish to continue to make it a political context, and by virtue of asking the question, how long is your commitment to this funding, we may not get the answer we want, but it certainly gives us a point at which to continue to campaign in relation to this issue. The other thing, though, I think which this relates to is the fact that we want to provide certainty to older people in our community and those who care for older people in our community, and the one way we do that is to continue talking about the sustainable funding model that is required. Whilst I probably would have actually liked us to talk about calling for an increase as well as an extension of the funding to meet the true cost of the services, I think the response that we'll get will give us some indication as to where the government stands at this stage. In order to see an extension beyond the current timeframe, we are going to need a significant and concerted effort by local government around the country, because it is, at the end of the day, the level of government closest to people. So I commend the recommendation. I also would just acknowledge the incredible work that our council officers are doing in partnership with the community and consumers of these services to make the case for what we need. That goes behind the scenes, but I think it often doesn't get recognised, and our officers are advocating all the time in partnership with other agencies and consumer groups. So we'll keep fighting.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Williams.
I too also want to say thank you to our officers and also for councillors for keeping this alive. I think it's really important. We've just seen in our gallery today regarding the car parking strategy, in reference to this support program, it's just as important because we are talking about our most vulnerable in our community, and it's paramount that we keep supporting those people, and it's important that we keep involving the community, involving at all different levels, including council, that we are on this journey together. And the longer that we stay on the journey, the longer that we all embrace it and we all can come to an end, that we're all obviously can be unanimous in the way we conclude this in the end. But I think it's really important that we keep it alive and we keep it going because, as I was saying, that it's we are talking about our most vulnerable in our community. It's going to take a while for them to comprehend, and it will be ongoing, and it will affect also future generations. It's not a program that will just be switched on and off. It's something that will affect for future generations.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. If we could just get Councillor Messina back in the room.
Can we note that as unanimous? Can we note it as unanimous?
We will note that as unanimous, sure. Thank you, Councillor Messina. We're now at 8.3, Eric Street Public Housing.
I have a question. I don't know if that helps us move things along. Whether we need someone to move the motion first.
I'm happy to move the motion.
Okay, moved by Councillor O'Meara. I'll get a seconder, and then Councillor Newton. So we're on 8.3, the Eric Street Public Housing Estate Agency. So I've got a mover and Councillor O'Meara, seconded by Councillor Newton, and Councillor Lassouf has a question.
I just have a question around the other avenues that might have been explored in terms of us keeping the allocation rights to Eric Street, but influencing the types of tenants that might be headed there. I know in the report that Ag Street and Home Street is an older person's estate where we allocate those public housing units to older people. And given, I guess, some of the issues that we've been discussing in terms of homelessness and the like, whether there is an option. Obviously it would take more time and effort, but to transition the housing into some other form of housing, because currently it's transitional, and whether it could be single women, another older person's estate. I'm just wondering if those options had been explored.
Okay, I'll refer that to Ms Jess Fraser. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So in regards to considering people who can live at Eric Street Housing Estate, the consideration at the moment in terms of moving to this new model would consider the statewide waiting list for housing, and that would obviously consider a whole range of vulnerability factors to determine places. It would also need to take into account that specific housing stock, which does have some limitations around who can live there at the moment. So throughout any allocation model, it would seek to prioritise people with the highest need and highest vulnerability that would be able to accommodate the single bedsit unit stock.
I've got a question.
You have a question, so we'll have a question from Councillor.
I've just got a question. I actually posed this question to our officers and I got a response this afternoon. The question is that with these with this community housing provider, and if we were to sign on to this, the question therefore becomes: will the tenants still be tenants of DHHS, or will they become, in inverted commas, privatised tenants of the community housing provider? So which is the case?
Thank you.
Mayor Rennie. If we were to proceed with the proposal, the allocation process would change and council would no longer be involved in that. DHHS would engage a different allocation process. If that was to involve a transitional housing provider, the new tenants would be engaged through that model and would be a tenant of the transitional housing provider who would provide them with a significant amount of support and seek to sustain their tenancy. If the tenancy is successful, the tenant would then move to a longer term model with the Department of Health and Human Services.
So, through you, Mayor Rennie, just to be clear, so those services that would be in place with the transitional housing provider are not available to tenants in the same way now. So for the new tenants, they'll have access to support in a way that current tenants haven't in the past. And it potentially creates a whole lot of benefits across the zone for this housing estate and all the tenants there, both current and new.
Thank you. I'll move to Councillor Amir as the mover of the motion.
So as has been discussed, this is in response to a request from DHHS to implement a new tenancy allocation process, taking council out of the equation, instead not being involved in the allocation of tenants. There's 42 bedsit units at Eric Street, which of course means it's not appropriate for all types of families, but of course we much need housing for vulnerable people here in Darebin, and I'm happy to support the recommendation by the officers and by DHHS. It's not going to change the level of support available for people at that site. It's not going to, there'll still be those with the highest need having access to those homes, and so I'm happy to support this, which will hopefully make things a bit more streamlined, hopefully reduce the load on council a bit in terms of officer time, and I hope we can still continue to support these residents in the way that councils support all vulnerable residents here in Darebin.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So I think something that's important to note from this report is the part where it says Darebin City Council has full tenancy nomination rights for this estate. This is a legacy agreement for when the City of Coburg gifted the land to the state in the 60s to develop the housing estate. The tenancy allocation process remained in place when the land was transferred to the City of Preston. So we can see that that happened 50 years ago or so. And what I see this happening, as our General Manager was saying, is that this does give a little bit more value to the current residents and the new tenants by going through DHHS. Going by the report, I don't think that council loses anything by making this move. I think this streamlines it, brings it into line with other estates, and I see value rather than any negativity.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Are there further speakers?
I'm going to speak against the motion. Sorry, I'm just going to move this. I'm kind of in two minds about this. I understand the streamlining of it and all of that, but I think once we give over these allocations, they're gone forever, and I don't feel like I've thought through this enough to say I'm ready to hand them over. I don't think, as a council, perhaps, and I missed the briefing on this because I was on leave, that perhaps we've explored the different options that we could use this housing for. I know that Eric Street is, in terms of the current residents, has had really serious issues happening there for quite some time, given the transitional residents that are working there, and given that they haven't had the support that they need, that the officers talk about that they need. But I just feel in two minds that once we give this allocation up, we don't have a say in who lives in those houses. We don't have a say in advocating for people who live with Darebin or have a connection to Darebin to access that public housing. And so for those reasons, I won't be supporting this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Lassurf. Are there further speakers?
I have a question. Can we explore what Councillor Lassurf has just said, and if that's possible, please?
Well, I think Ms Henderson previously answered that, and it was the discussion of a lengthy briefing that we've had. So, Ms Henderson, do you have anything to add, or you've...
Through you, Mayor, I would say if people could, a thing to bear in mind is that we try and take an asset-based approach when we're speaking publicly about our communities. And so the report is written with that in mind, and we haven't gone into detail about some of the challenges that are faced there because, you know, we want the community to be a positive one. So it's just something to be aware of in terms of how the report is written.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
I'm going to speak in favour of this. I appreciate Councillor Lassurf's concern. Where I think this is interesting is that it actually takes us into a different space in relation to the Eric Street estate, because as councillors would see in the report, there is a commitment for a local agency to undertake community development work, which currently doesn't occur in the way that we would like to see. So council's role shifts in this case, if we were to take up this opportunity, from being the referral mechanism to in fact being the advocate for the health and well-being of those residents, because they are members of our community, even if they are sometimes in a transitional arrangement accessing this housing. I would I'd probably be careful myself in starting to talk about the performance of the Department of Housing and Human Services in relation to some of our estates, because we know from the evidence from some of our community that there have been issues where basic needs haven't been met, basic maintenance hasn't been undertaken. So this puts us in a really interesting space. I support us proceeding with this proposal because I think it gives us a clearer mechanism to go in and fight for those residents and improve their outcomes. The allocation component for me is not the primary issue. It's actually about making sure that the Department of Housing and Human Services does the best job possible to support what are often a very vulnerable group of people. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as community representatives to keep that pressure in the right place. So we potentially are freed up in that way. I wouldn't necessarily want to see us go down the same path in relation to the other estates, particularly Home Street, which serves a very particular purpose. So there's an interesting question here. This is a much smaller estate with 40-odd properties, and obviously there's the opportunity to see some improvement to the way that that mix of different groups of people comes together. On that basis, I'm happy to support it, but I think we need to be careful about our role going forward.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there further speakers? Yes, you can have a question, and then...
Can I just confirm that the site is owned and managed by the state government? Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, yes, the site is owned and managed by the state government.
Thank you.
It's a supplementary question to that. But under these new arrangements, if we were to vote in favour of this motion, will the site continue to be owned by the state government, and more importantly, will the tenancies be managed by the state government or handed over to a private provider?
Good question.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, the stock would continue to remain the property of the Department of Health and Human Services. If the allocation plan was to change to a transitional housing managed model for new tenancies for a 12-month period, that tenancy would be with a transitional housing provider. After that 12 months, if the tenancy was successful, the tenant would become a tenant of the Department of Health and Human Services.
Just a supplementary question to that. If the tenant, after the 12 months, would they become permanent in the same area, in the same Eric Street, or a permanent in another place? So what I'm trying to get to, do we transform this particular estate into a privately managed estate?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, if the tenancy was successful after 12 months, the tenant would have the choice to stay at that unit. They may wish to choose to transfer to another location down the track, but they would retain their tenancy at Eric Street if that's their choice.
Yeah. Can I speak in relation to the motion? Look, I'm going to speak against the motion. Originally I had an amendment, but after what I've heard, I'm not convinced. And I think two things are happening here. One thing is obviously, as Councillor Lesurf said, we're giving away something that Council had, and that we're giving it away. And I understand the benefit that will be gained, but I'm not sure whether giving away our first call, if you like, is warranted in this case. I think that the benefit that the tenants are going to get in terms of transitional housing, that could come anyway, without us having to give away our first call on these properties. The other thing that's happening, which to me is a very subtle thing, but it's a very important thing, and it hasn't been adequately covered in this report, and I'm disappointed about that. That's why I've raised these questions, is that the model that's been proposed, councillors, is a model which moves away from public housing. It moves it into the space of, whether you want to call it community housing or social, it moves it essentially into the space away from government, being the landlords, if you like, to outsourcing it or privatising it to other organisations that then manage that particular site. I have objections to that. And I have very strong objections to that. And my objections to that is that there is a screaming demand from the community about not only maintaining the existing stock of public housing that we have, but increasing that stock of public housing where the government plays a greater interventionist role in relation to public housing. Here there is a slippage that is occurring through the department of into, shoving it off into the, social housing or these other NGOs that, sort of miraculously that they will be able to provide more than what government provides. I'm very sceptical of that will be the case, and on that basis, I'm not supporting this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there further speakers? There being none, I'll pass to Councillor Amir if you would like a right of reply. No. I will therefore put that to the vote. All those in favour? Councillor Amir, you moved the motion.
So could we be clear about that?
Yeah, okay. All those in favour? Against? That vote is tied. I'll therefore exercise my casting vote in favour of that motion. So that motion is carried.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
It was clear to me that once the motion was brought forward by Councillor Amir, sorry, I should stand, that she had hesitations. Is a councillor able to move a motion and then not support that motion during the debate?
I'd have to refer that to governance. I think at the end of the day, Councillor Amir did exercise her vote.
That wasn't the question I asked.
I heard the question. I'll refer that for governance advice.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, thank you for the question. Councillors are entitled to vote any way they want, irrespective of whether they've moved a motion. The purpose of debate is to consider the issues that are raised and that can at times influence people's thinking. My observation would be, though, that all councillors voted in this instance.
I'd like to see if we can actually vote on that motion again, because it appeared to me that...
Sorry, Councillor Amir, no.
Amir wanted to vote a different...
Councillor Amir. No, we've had a vote. Thank you. 8.4, homelessness relief and accommodation options. Moved by Councillor Newton, seconded. It hasn't been seconded.
I'm happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Moved by Councillor Newton, so over to you.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So homelessness is a really challenging topic for council in terms of what our role is, what our role should be. And this came up as a result of a notice motion put through by Councillor Williams recently to look into what we could do. We're going through the budget process at the moment and we've come back with some recommendations. I really want to thank the staff for all their work on getting us to this point. This is something where I think it's really easy to come up with suggestions like a sleep bus or, opening up the hall to have people sleeping here. But when you dig into that, it's actually really, really difficult. So you're talking about having to put in infrastructure for showers. You're having to think about security. You can only do that for one gender exam, etc. So I'm quite pleased that we are taking this seriously and that the recommendation is two things in particular, which is develop and deliver a shower access pilot at Reservoir Leisure Centre. And for when we're looking at the budget, to consider allocating an additional $157,500 in the 2019-20 budget to pilot an assertive outreach program in Darebin for a 2-year period. The things that I just wanted to particularly highlight from the report are that even though sometimes you think that, or maybe a visible sector of people that are homeless are men, I was really struck by the report where it said family violence is the single biggest cause of homelessness in Victoria and Australia. In the recent 2016 census, 42% of homeless Victorians said they're homeless due to family violence. 39% said they're homeless due to financial hardship or housing crisis. So I think it's not always the homelessness that we see, but it's the reality of homelessness which can be hidden. So again, I really commend our officers for bringing this to us in the way that they have. And I think that this way forward is one that does allow us to make a difference while not necessarily replicating what other levels of government or other sectors do, but rather considering assertive outreach that can be provided by an expert in that area.
Thank you, Councillor Newton, and seconded by Councillor Amir.
So this is a response to a NOM, as mentioned by Councillor Newton, but also I think a desire from all councillors to be tackling the issue of people sleeping rough in Darebin. It's something that really, I guess, pulls at the heartstrings, and we feel like it's something we want to do to help people find a permanent home. So in coming to this point, staff worked really closely gathering a lot of information from the homelessness sector, really understanding what the problems were, what was driving people sleeping rough, where some of the gaps were, and how council could use its resources in terms of its physical space, its other buildings, spaces like this and buildings like Reservoir Leisure Centre, or providing financial support. So what came out really clearly from that is that some ideas that might seem good on the surface, like opening up this hall to rough sleepers, weren't necessarily supported by the sector for a couple of reasons, partly because of some of the safety issues that the cost of being able to guarantee safe financial cost is very high, and of course those kinds of proposals don't fix the causes of homelessness, and that is where we can be most impactful. That said, I also understand I'm one of those people who does get drawn into wanting to help those people who are most vulnerable, and these two solutions put forward here, one around providing shower access can provide a really basic need, and also some of the advice provided was that by having this outreach program, it supports people to prevent them from becoming long-term rough sleepers, and then connecting them back into housing while they're still, it is the best chance of them being reconnected with housing and making a really big difference, hopefully, in the longer term. So I'm happy to support this recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Are there further speakers? Councillor Williams.
Hi. Thank you to the officers for the report. The reason why I brought this to council was because homelessness does not discriminate on your age, your gender or your culture. I was quite affected by seeing the amount of homeless people that are actually on our street. I actually saw one only a couple of days ago that was sitting at the front of council offices. The whole point of this was that we have a number of freezing nights that are below zero, and I wanted to open our halls, which we don't use. I wanted to have our swimming pools open for an extra hour to mainly allow people to freshen up. It was mainly to help those who are most vulnerable, which are usually women and children. I would like to try and continue fighting for those people, because nobody anticipates on wanting to be homeless or to be couch surfing at people's homes, and of course most times they are quite embarrassed or quite shy and do not want to tell people of their circumstances. Most times their circumstances will involve a family violence or mental health issues, and I think trying to keep people as independent as possible is a great way of going forward. I know it's better if we can to avoid that situation, but there's times where people actually fall between the gaps and they find themselves homeless. It can happen in a matter of days, sometimes weeks. And that was the whole point of me bringing the notice of motion, so we could actually help our most vulnerable here in Darebin. It's nice to think that you and I are on a cold winter night when it's below zero, that we're in bed in our electric blankets, when those who are out on our street, our most vulnerable, are freezing to death. And having just some sort of comfort, some sort of shelter of those -degree nights would be fantastic, that council could open their doors just to give them that a little bit of comfort. It doesn't happen often that we do have those -degree nights, but it'd be nice to actually offer that.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Yeah, look, I just have a small amendment, and I just wonder if councillors will entertain this, that in relation to point 4, where pilots a shower access program at Reservoir Leisure Centre and the Northcote Aquatic Centre, Recreation Centre, so both centres. And So I'll put that forward and I'll explain, if I get the opportunity, to why I'm putting that forward.
I'll just seek advice from Ms Henderson because we don't control the Northcote Aquatic Centre.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, look, if that's something that's of interest to councillors, I'd strongly recommend keep the trial to Reservoir Leisure Centre where we can control conditions totally, because we run that site. We don't run the site at NARC when we don't manage the NARC facility, and I think we could certainly be in discussions with them about extending it, but let's see if it works first at Reservoir Leisure Centre would be my recommendation.
Okay.
The nodding was, I agree.
Okay, so I'll just ask the mover and the seconder if they accept that amendment.
So I don't accept that amendment.
So therefore I'd ask if there's a seconder, or Councillor Greco, it hasn't been accepted.
I'll put it because I want to explain and give councillors an opportunity of why I'm putting forward that simple amendment.
So
I'll put it forward.
Okay, so it's been seconded by Councillor Williams, so we're now debating the amendment. So Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Councillor. Look, why I'm putting that forward is that I understand that yes, we're going to have a pilot in relation to Reservoir, but Darebin is a big city, and the city is a city that's quite distinct from the north to the south. And I thought that it would be good to actually pilot it in both sides because, as we know, people who are homeless are very localised in their. Usually, they don't have public transport, they don't have access to a lot of other things, rather than concentrating the pilot in the Reservoir Leisure Centre only, I think we could do both in terms of the Northcote Aquatic and Recreation Centre. This will enable us to see how both work, how both run, and there could be cross-learnings between the two centres. And as we've seen, councillors, homelessness is increasing in our city. It's dispersed in our city. It's not concentrated in the north. It's, from my understanding, it's quite dispersed. It's probably more concentrated in the southern end of the city rather than the northern end of the city, because the northern end of the city is much more sparse in terms of other services and other support mechanisms. So that's why I think we need to provide the pilot also in the southern end of the city to give homeless people also that access. Also, I think what it will do is that by having by having it also in the NARC centre, it will enable the other providers around us in terms of offering them additional referral places for people who are homeless and seeking to clean themselves up, have a shower and things like that, rather than trying to sort of say, yeah, there is a place, but it's out there in Reservoir, hard to get to, very little public transport, and if you haven't got a car, it's virtually impossible to get there. So I would encourage councillors to reconsider it. I mean, we're already doing it. We know that there's a real urgent need around homelessness. I'll be interested to see what comes back in terms of the two pilots. If we're doing a pilot for one, I think it would be easy enough to do a pilot for the other one, so we could cover as much as the city area as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Williams.
This is nothing new. All around the world, churches and community groups, and including aquatic centres and other centres and halls, open their doors for homeless people. The whole point of me bringing this to council in the first place was that we can make a difference. We can make a change at this level. If you have a heart, I think that you will open your place, and we have a number of council assets that we can do this, and we can start here. We don't have to go to a federal and state level. We can start it here at this level. We can make changes. We can be a pilot in showing other municipalities that this can happen, and that we can open our doors just to allow a few people to obviously freshen up and feel that they can continue from day to day, and they can feel actually be part of this community. I think the more that we keep people isolated, the more the gap will get bigger, and the mental stress and strain that it has on people who are in this situation, it just exacerbates the situation. And I just think if you have a heart, I think that we could do more. And it's incumbent on us as councillors that we have that power, and I think that we should be able to do more in this situation. The whole point of having not only just Reservoir, but having the Northcote Aquatic Centre. Not everybody can go from one end of Darebin to the other end, and it'd be great that if both of them are opened to allow people to have a shower, to feel inclusive.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Speakers on the amendment?
Mayor, I actually have an amendment to the amendment. So do I need to deal with to make it legally compliant? So we need to deal with the amendment first?
No, perhaps you could speak to the amendment as it stands and in your speech.
Well, I'll speak to the... no, I can't speak to the amendment.
Okay. No, as in speak to the amendment that is on the table.
I'll speak in favour of the amendment, but I'll also foreshadow a set of words that I think need to be inserted, and I will put those words should this amendment be accepted. Should they be supported or voted on? Which is that we have a problem in relation to the proposal as it stands, which is that the operator of the Northcote Aquatic Centre is the YMCA. We have a contractual relationship with the YMCA in relation to what takes place on site, and we need to respect that. So I completely agree that it would be wonderful to pilot this. I think the substantive motion put forward by officers was to look at a centre that we actually run rather than that we own, because it's easier to get this going. So I would foreshadow that if this is supported, I propose the additional words of and, subject to agreement with the operator YMCA before the reference to the Northcote Aquatic Centre, just so that we aren't potentially putting ourselves in a contractual situation with the YMCA, because they would in fact be absolutely critical, just like the emergency relief organisations, to making this work. And I would also say, having dealt with them in relation to a number of issues locally with people who are highly disadvantaged, who are able to access the centre there, that they are highly aware of the issues of homelessness, rough sleeping, and people that are literally living in cars nearby who do use those facilities. We need to be cognisant of the fact that there are service systems in place that actually support people. We don't want to undermine those, and some of those are quite informal. So I commend Councillor Greco's additional point. I think it would have been good for us to have a little bit more time to consider this before tonight to get the wording right, but I would support it if, and then I'd propose that amendment as well.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'd like to speak against the amendment. So this report is something that our council officers put a lot of work into about what could work and what might not work. This is something we're talking about the next 2 years, instigating it, doing a pilot, seeing what's possible. And we are talking about real people here. So for me, the difference with the Reservoir Leisure Centre is that it is run by council. Councillor Greco and I and Councillor Lawrence work quite closely with the Reservoir Neighbourhood House as well as the Reservoir Leisure Centre. We know that there's a community gym program there, that there's a refugee program there, and it's our staff that are working on that. So for me, I see that at Reservoir Leisure Centre we have a fairly controlled environment to do the pilot project in, which I think is something where we can look really closely at how it pans out in these 6 months to then see if it's worth rolling out to Northcote Aquatic and Leisure Centre. And I just think that this is something where we really want to get it right. And for me, that means doing a pilot project. It is a pilot, seeing if we can get it right at Reservoir Leisure Centre before considering rolling it out to Northcote.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Messina.
I'd like to vote in favour of the amendment that put forward by Councillor Greco. In the last few weeks, I've gotten home, as you know, we all get home late at night, and I have been freezing, and I've often thought about what it would be like in the streets. I'm well aware that people my age, 50-plus-year-old women, some of them don't have jobs. Some of them have no superannuation to support them. Some of them are on the streets, cold, hungry. And if I can say, put somebody at the Northcote Aquatic Centre and say, no, we'll wait 6 months because we're waiting for a pilot project, Who's to say that we cannot have a pilot project at 2 different destinations? And if I can support somebody being warm and fed at night, then I say yes to hold a pilot program over 2 precincts.
Thank you. Are there other speakers to the amendment?
I just have a question, and maybe it's a question that relates to the substantive, but I've just thought of it, so I'll ask it now. In terms of the pilot, it's proposed to happen for 6 months and has been costed in the agenda for $4,500. No, sorry, $4,500, sorry. I'm assuming that the amendment would mean that that would double the cost, and is there enough in the budget to, if the pilot was successful, to continue it in the 6 months after?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, I believe that if you wanted to have the initial pilot include NARC as well, there'll need to be a budget allocation made for that, because I would expect there'll be a contractual variation that results.
And sorry, just a second part of the question in terms of if the pilot is successful, because it's supposed to be a 6-month period, will there be money in the budget to continue it as a program rather than just a pilot?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, this motion's been on the floor of council for, I suppose, 10 minutes, so we haven't worked out all the details yet.
No, just in Reservoir, for example. So we've budgeted $4,500. Will that cover the full year if the pilot is successful?
With Reservoir Leisure Centre, because council funds and manages those staff, we believe that the resources, which are essentially mostly staff resources, can be absorbed within the budget. It's different when we're paying a contracted management group who, a not-for-profit management group, but they have to recover their costs exactly, or their model doesn't work.
Okay, does that answer your question, Councillor Elizabeth?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to the amendment? No, there is no right of reply on an amendment, so I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour of the amendment? And against? The amendment is carried.
Mayor, I'd like to move an amendment to the substantive motion, which includes the amendment, which is after the word and, so after the words Reservoir Leisure Centre and, to insert the words, comma, subject to agreement with the operator YMCA, comma. Subject to agreement with the operator YMCA, comma.
Is that accepted to the mover?
Yes, I accept.
And the seconder? Yes, so that is now the substantive motion having been accepted by the mover and the seconder. So we'll continue with the debate on this. We've heard from the mover and the seconder, so are there other speakers to the motion? Councillor Greco.
Just quickly speak in relation to the motion in general. Look, I thank Councillor McCarthy for including that. Like that we cover all bases in relation to our contractual obligation, but I'm pretty sure that the YMCA, given that they espouse to be a community-based type organisation, that they will come with goodwill in terms of seeing how they could actually help to implement this if it does actually fall outside of the strictly their legal obligations. Look, I think we're taking a positive step here. This has come back to us in a number of ways. This report, initially we weren't happy with what was being provided. It was I would call too bureaucratic of an approach initially. Now we're getting more into the practical side of things. And I say that as also acknowledging the expert advice that we have received from the people that deal with homeless situations. But at the same time, instinct tells you that you need to have some sort of practical outcome too, and that an overly bureaucratic response, particularly from a council, is perhaps not totally warranted, because it's not something that councils can actually address, the causes of homelessness. We're responding to the, if you like, to the effect of homelessness, the symptoms of homelessness. It's not up to us to actually solve the homelessness. We've got no capacity or no finance or no legislative power to actually do that. What we can offer is some relief, and some assistance to people facing homelessness at the coal face. As other councillors have said, I've seen if begging is an indication of the increase in homelessness, I've seen lots of begging in our streets, particularly at the Northcote Plaza. On one particular Saturday, I saw 4 people probably not even within 50 metres of each other begging, which to me really shocked me. So I look forward to this policy being implemented so we can move a step forward.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there further speakers? Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. I have some regret this evening because in relation to both this item and also the DHHS item and the following item, these are the sorts of debates which we have in this chamber on a regular basis, and we had a full chamber here this evening of people who I think deserve to know about the work that we're doing in this space, and I think would probably have a strong affinity for the efforts that are being made on issues that don't necessarily directly fall within Council's remit, but which we know require some Council response. And as other councillors, including Councillor Greco just now, have made reference to, tackling homelessness is in fact an issue that is a shared responsibility between not only all 3 levels of government, but I would go a step further and say the corporate sector, the community sector, the public in general. I say this because when we speak about homelessness, and the report makes this very clear, we are not speaking just about the people that you see sleeping rough on the streets in the CBD. We are speaking about the people who move from one couch to another, who sleep in cars, young people who have to leave home, not forever, but for a period of weeks, in order to be safe because of family violence. And my concern with this issue is that it is so easy for us to simply grab what we think is a quick and easy solution, which is wash the homeless, give them access to a shower, and then on your way. That's not a systemic response. It's not a response that actually delivers real change. What delivers real change in this space is in fact the things that we do in partnership with other organisations, and those are the things where we actually support particularly those young people and those women who have been disconnected from a safe place to live into things like work, into things like connection to social groups. So we need to stay on the case. This is not going to solve anything. It's going to provide some support and assertive relief. We need to be honest about it, but we need to actually be talking more with our community about the community-led response, which is compassionate and strategic and ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there further speakers? Being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously, and we'll note that it was unanimous. Thank you. That brings us to item 8.5.
I'll move that, Mayor.
Moved by Councillor McCarthy and seconded by Councillor Lassurf. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. This item comes to us as a request from the Australia Institute for Darebin to sign on to an open letter for a climate disaster levy. Councillors who aren't aware of the work of the Australia Institute would be interested to know that a lot of the things that we advocate for and agitate for through our state and national forums are very in line with the policy settings of the Australia Institute that looks for economically sound, future-focused social and environmental policies. In this case, there is a direct alignment with their request for the establishment of a climate disaster levy. In fact, it is not that dissimilar to the very motion that we are taking to the Australian Local Governance Conference next week, which myself and the Mayor will be representing Council at, where we will be advocating for a $10 billion fund to support climate resilience in communities, because we know, not just in places like Darebin, but all around the country, it is local governments that are bearing the brunt of the failure of state and federal governments to take the serious action on emissions, and as a result, human lives, property, landscapes and ecology are all at continuous risk. The climate disaster levy goes that next step, not only to talking about the opportunity for federal funding to support climate adaptation at the local level, but also to actually put the financial penalty right where it starts. And as councillors would see there, there is a direct reference there to actually linking this to the the activities of fossil fuel related industries. So I fully support this. I appreciate the officer's speed in bringing this to us. This is part of a package of advocacy that we do. Whilst some in our community may question what's a council's role in advocating for these sorts of things, particularly when we talk about imposing a levy on fossil fuel exports from Australia. These things are interrelated. When we have heat waves, it is part of a climate change experience. Our pensioners are at risk and we have to respond, and we have been doing that for a number of years. If we do not see that national and global action on climate and on the climate emergency, these things will get worse. So this is one of a number of advocacy measures that we're supporting, and I'm very pleased to stand here and argue for council to sign on to this in this case.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lasserf.
Well, Councillor McCarthy summed it up pretty well, but I guess the bit that I would like to reiterate is that our climate emergency plan is an ambitious plan. It recognises the dire situation that we are facing as humanity right now. But what it also highlights is no matter how much action we take locally, we cannot do it alone, and we do not hold all the levers, so we need to advocate. And so advocacy and mobilisation is a big part of our emergency response. So this is just one example of how we can do this. As Councillor McCarthy said, this is very much the polluter pays principle. It is placing a levy on fossil fuel exporters to pay for the over 1 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere that they put in there every year. And they're currently not paying a single cent for that, and the cost and the impact that has around the world in terms of emissions and a changing climate. So this is, as it says in the Australia Institute letter, this is a fair, equitable and economically responsible way to meet our increasing costs in response to natural disasters and climate change impacts. So I support this motion. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Lasserf. Are there further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Look, I support this, and I think it's a really good strategy and approach that is being taken by the Australia Institute. I think also the strategy, a little bit, it reminds me of the 20-year-long strategy that is being used by the anti-smoking, if you like, lobby or organisation, where tobacco companies were levied for, and that money was used to actually promote anti-smoking campaigns. And we've seen how over the last 20 years that it's been quite successful. If we just look at the rates in terms of smoking in Australia, they've dramatically dropped, and that would not have been achieved without those funds. And those funds being used intelligently, strategically, in terms of raising awareness in the community about the dangers of smoking. So a levy of this nature placed on the same very polluters, I think could help in terms of raising awareness in our community about the impact of fossil fuels in relation to climate change. Because if we have a look at the last federal election, I think we would all agree that a lot of work needs to be done in this space. Because if you like, the dark side, I call them the dark side, they can easily manipulate the media. They can easily manipulate people in scaring them in relation to not so much of what the impacts of climate change will be, but in terms of manipulating people in that, we shouldn't be doing anything in that space, keep governments out of people's pockets and things like that. So this type of approach, putting a levy on the polluters themselves and using that money to educate people will be a great way forward.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there further speakers? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. That brings us to 8.6.
Happy to move.
Moved by Councillor McCarthy and seconded by Councillor Lasserf. Councillor McCarthy.
I've referred to this twice before this evening, and it's super exciting to actually get to speak to it. Some councillors would be aware that this has been a project that has been bubbling away in the background for some time, and is no great secret in the local government sector, but is sure to become a fantastic story of this council, but also not just this council, but also another 38 councils who Darebin Council has brought together as a buyers group to effectively do what has already been done through a set of inner Melbourne councils, which is to form effectively a buyers group to look at an opportunity to source renewable energy to power our own activities. And in this case, we've set up, and we'll, by virtue of this evening, we'll set up the first stage in the feasibility of establishing a local government power purchase agreement, or otherwise known as a PPA project. This is important work because we, for many years in the past, have looked at models such as purchasing green power as a way to have a renewable energy stream, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are influencing and changing the actual power that is generated. We're simply buying the clean energy. The difference here is that we're acting as a significant change agent by creating the financing mechanism for a significant piece of renewable energy infrastructure, whether that's solar, wind. That's part of the mechanics of the work that's taking place. And significantly, and I just want to reinforce this to councillors who I know have been briefed about this, but I think it's really important to remind ourselves of what the role is that we're playing, which is as the lead organisation that has brokered this relationship with 38 other councils, has brought them together to say this is so important, we need to work together, we are happy to play the lead, and that's what this motion would commit us to doing. But also, as the point 2 in the motion recommends, approves the commitment of all of council's large market and unmetered streetlight accounts for this particular power purchase agreement. So this is a massive piece of work in terms of what it will do, in terms of where we get our energy from, but also it will influence the development of renewable energy renewable energy infrastructure potentially beyond Darebin area. And just like with the PPA that was taken place led by the City of Melbourne a couple of years ago, which of course received a lot of public fanfare, this is several times larger, and I think it is an enormous piece of work. Our officers need to be commended. This is being watched very closely by other states around Australia. It is the largest PPA, I understand, in Australia, and will have a significant impact for years to come. So please support it, councillors.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lassurf.
I'd like to, just to begin with, the first thing I'd like to point out is the way council traditionally purchases electricity is through group purchasing in a similar way, but via MAV or Procurement Australia. These are usually short-term contracts and expose us to a whole lot of volatility to the market because of the short-term nature of those contracts, and it has been quite volatile over the last few years. So the benefit of moving to a PPA is it will lock us into a long-term contract, but we know that that we will be able to fix a price to some extent to buffer ourselves from that volatility. But we also we'll know exactly where our electricity is being generated from. One of the benefits from the Melbourne Renewable Energy Project is that you can point to a wind farm in Western Victoria, and it has been built as a result of that project. It wouldn't have gone ahead otherwise. The PPA market is a maturing market. MREP, I guess, has helped it along its way, but there are lots of shovel-ready projects that need certainty, investment certainty across Victoria and across Australia to really fuel the renewable energy transition that we need to be on to move ourselves to 100% renewable energy in response to the climate emergency. And so we need to act. Our role as a facilitator and our lead council is really about bringing councils together and acting as a facilitator of this buying group. And that is still a real gap in the market in terms of bringing groups together and leading a process. If you have a small energy load, it's really hard to do it alone. You need a big energy load, which we have put together, which Councillor McCarthy said before is quite large. I'm not sure if it's the largest, but it's big. To be able to, I guess, have the negotiating influence to get a really good price on electricity, but also get the renewable energy generation as well. So I am fully 100% supportive of this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Lassurf. Are there further speakers? No, every so often something comes before this chamber which I think truly gives us great pleasure, and this may well be one of those things in terms of its significance. So I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried unanimously. 8.7,
I'll move that, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Greco, and seconded by Councillor Lassurf.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, again, this is very much an administrative procedure in relation to the proposed sale of discontinued roads. And here we have 3 particular roads that are being considered. One is on Banff Street, Barry Street and Barton Street. Just to emphasise, councillors, that the process that we're about to embark on, if we vote in favour of the recommended motion by officers, is to commence the statutory process. We're just at the beginning of this process. Just a few things. One is that there's already been some interest that has been demonstrated by some of the adjoining property owners in purchasing the property after initial consultation with them. But if we adopt this motion, what it will mean is that council will go through a formal consultation process with the adjoining owners, and that the adjoining owners will be able to put in submissions if they have further thoughts about acquiring these discontinued roads. So that's the crux of it, and so just seeking council support to proceed with the process.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Lassurf, nothing to add. Any further speakers? There are none. I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us, 8.8, contract award. Happy to move it? And you are moving it with...
Do you want me to read it out?
Read it out, or are you moving as per the recommendation? Might ask the officers if they have that and could put it up on the board. Those are the names, Councillor Amir, that you expected there? That's, yes, great, thank you. So that's moved by Councillor Amir and seconded by Councillor Williams. Thank you. Councillor Amir.
It's getting late, so I'll keep it quick. This is a contract for minor works. For 4 years, there's been tender process undertaken, and the details are in the confidential briefing that was provided to us, and I'm very grateful for this, all this kind of work that happens that we usually don't necessarily pay attention to until it's not done, and I really value that detail orientation that I'm confident will be delivered under Vito's excellent leadership from previously and for the remainder of his time here.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Williams?
Nothing further to add.
Any further speakers? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us to the end of consideration of reports. Consideration of responses to petitions, notices of motion and general business. There are none. Notices of motion, 10.1, we've done it. Fortunately, we don't have to start again. 11, reports of standing committees, none. 12, records of assemblies of councillors. Moved by Councillor Lassurf, seconded by Councillor Williams. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Reports by Mayor and Councillors, moved by Councillor Messina, seconded by Councillor Amir. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Consideration of reports considered confidential. There are none. So that brings us to the close of the meeting. And thank you particularly to Keith and Serena for sticking with us until the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you.